This is the scariest episode from my childhood. It took place in 1991, when I was 8 years old. I lived in a village on the Norwegian countryside, with my parents and 2 older brothers. There weren't many kids around for us to play with, so we always stuck together, despite the age difference. I was 8, my brothers 10 and 12. It was a safe neighborhood and we were really outdoorsy kids. It was fine for us just to return home and eat, and then go back out again and play in the woods or go fishing in the nearby lake. In autumn of 1991, my oldest brother dared us to sneak through the hedge to the abandoned property that was located close by. We had always thought of it as a haunted house, but really it was just an old house where the man who started the village brick factory once lived. No one had lived there for ages, and the paint was starting to peel off, and several of the windows were broken. Our parents would tell us never to go there. Their reason was, of course, they feared that we would get hurt playing there, but we thought it was because it was haunted. But that day we dared to walk around in the garden, and now had a dried up pond, an old well, and several old and dying fruit trees, and even tools in the old shed. It looked as if someone had just walked out one day and never returned, leaving everything as it was. We soon came to think of the garden as ours, and played there all the time. We climbed the trees, used the tools to build things. It was great, our very own secret playground. We suspected that people in the village had seen us, because soon our parents would ask us if we had gone there, despite it being strictly forbidden, which of course we denied, but someone must have complained. We were rather loud and untamed kids. Until one day in November. I remember since it was in the days before my birthday. It was a damp and rainy day, and we weren't really in the mood to play outside. But our mom had chased us out of the house, so she could clean in peace, and we weren't allowed back until an hour later. So we decided to try and open the old cellar. I'm not sure what the word is in English for this kind of cellar, but imagine, if you will, a hatch that opens almost horizontally to the ground, then a few steps that lead you down to a dugout cellar, with stone walls and a dirt floor. It was used to store vegetables and such, but it was empty now. All of us climbed down to have a look. The plan was to write our names in the inside of the cellar, as if to mark it as our own. Suddenly the hatch slammed shut above us, and the cellar became completely dark. I started screaming, and my older brothers tried to open the hatch. When my oldest brother, Sindri, pushed the hatch open, he saw a man's hand holding a small axe.
"Come on out, trespassing little brats,"
the voice growled, the axe close to the opening of the hatch. "Hell no," Sindri shouted back and slammed the hatch shut from the inside.
"All right, little brats. I know you're in there, all 3 of you little shits. Does your mommy know you're in there? Well, does she? I bet she doesn't. No one will look for you."
We heard him dropping the axe and start to move around with something else. Soon we realized that he had taken out a hammer, and before we knew it, he started to nail shut the hatch. I threw myself at the hatch, determined to get out. But the moment the hatch opened just a tiny bit, he reached for the axe again.
"Come on now, come on out. It's the better choice, really. It must be awfully dark and damp in there. Aren't you afraid of the dark? Go on, let your little brother out." Let him out.
He laughed, and we could all hear that he was drunk. My older brother Emil was pleading with the man to let us go, promising that we would never return, but his words fell on deaf ears. The rain had started to fall really heavily now, and we heard thunder outside. The drunk man with the hammer was cursing and moving around outside, clearly bothered by the bad weather.
"I might come back to let you out one day, or maybe I'll butcher all 3 of you,"
he whispered through the wooden door as he hammered the hatch shut. We were too terrified to do anything, but Sindri told us to keep calm and it would be okay, as he surely was just out to scare us. The dark was compact inside the cellar, and it was cold and damp. After a long while of silence from the man outside, we started to wonder if he had left. Sindri decided that we should count to 100 and then try to get out. We counted loudly and then used our hands to find the hatch. It was definitely nailed shut. Sindri then told us to feel around the stone walls for a loose stone, and we did, cutting our palms upon the sharp edges. Eventually we did find one, and it was surprisingly easy to remove from its place. The cellar was old and had not been tended to for ages. and the rainy climate of the Norwegian coast had left the wooden hatch doors rather soft with age. The cellar was built in such a way that it was almost impossible to get a good forward motion in order to break the wood, but fueled by panic and adrenaline, we broke the lower half open. Being closest to the ground, it was softer and easier to tear apart. We started digging with our hands, creating a small opening out. Being the smallest, my brothers pushed me out of the cellar, and I could see that the man was in fact gone. My brothers were too big to fit in the small opening, and Sindri said I would have to get the hammer and get the hatch open. I was absolutely petrified that the man would come back with the axe, and I would have to run, leaving my brothers to die, or stay, and be slaughtered. At 8 years old, I had no doubt that that would have happened. I got the hammer, but I couldn't get the nails out, so I used the hammer to simply break the hatch into pieces. Soon we were all three running for dear life across the garden and to our house, where Mom threw a fit over the state of our clothes and hands and demanded to know what we have been up to. Nothing, we all lied, unsure of what to say. We never went back there again. We never even looked that way. The man with the axe? I have no idea who he was or where he came from. I wonder if he was just a drifter living in the abandoned house, not wanting noisy kids to disturb the peace. We've never told anyone about it, but every year, when Sindri, Emil, and I reunite at the family home for Christmas, we always ask if there's any news about the old ghost house down the street, and has anyone moved in there yet. This happened to me just over a week ago. I was driving north from DC to Massachusetts to visit my sister who had just had her first baby. It was about 9 p.m. when I crossed over the Delaware Bridge and made my way onto the New Jersey Turnpike. I was listening to NPR and sipping on an energy drink, traveling about 65 or 70 miles per hour in my rented Tucson when my cell phone started to ring. I've been pulled over and ticketed for driving while on my phone before, so I pulled my car over to the side of the road. I was about 13 miles north of the bridge, and directly to my right where I had pulled over was a warehouse of some kind, with a parking lot behind a chain-link fence. The property even had its own overpass extending over the road, so people traveling in the southbound lane could access it. I parked my car on the shoulder of the road and answered my phone, which turned out to be my mother, just checking up on my progress. She had already flown in from Florida to be with my sister during the birth, as well as to escape from Hurricane Irma. We spoke on the phone for perhaps 2 minutes before I told her that I would see her soon, and we hung up. I was about to put the car in drive and continue on my way when I caught something out of the corner of my eye to the right. Standing in the darkness directly on the other side of the chain-link fence was a man who appeared to be wearing a gas mask, staring right back at me. I squinted hard as I peered back at him through the darkness. There was some illumination from the overhead streetlights, and of course, there were the headlights from other cars, but I couldn't get a clear view of him. For the first several seconds, I was convinced that I was just hallucinating, because there was no way anyone could be wearing an old-fashioned World War II style gas mask in a parking lot late at night just staring at people in this day and age. After what felt like 30 seconds, I concluded that it had to be a prank, a pretty creepy one too. The guy had barely moved since I made eye contact with him. I cracked a smirk and waved towards him, but he seemed fully dedicated to the performance because he didn't acknowledge the wave. I started to chuckle and glanced down to pick up my phone back up off the passenger seat, intending to take a video of him. But when I raised my head and aimed the phone towards the fence, my heart literally skipped a beat as I saw the figure stomping across the grass right towards me, having apparently walked directly through the fence. I screamed as the figure raised something above his head. I'm not sure what it was, perhaps it was a pipe or a crowbar, but I didn't wait to find out. I put my car in drive and floored it out of there, speeding down the turnpike at almost 90 miles an hour. I didn't look behind me. I just kept driving flat out for about 2 minutes before I slowed back down to about 60 and tried to collect myself. I knew there hadn't been a gate at that part of the fence because I had been staring at it for a better part of a minute. Had there been a gate, I wouldn't have hung around. But what the hell just happened? If it was a ghost or something, it hadn't been transparent. It looked completely real. I pulled off the turnpike at the next rest stop and sat in my car, trying to make sense of it all. If it had been a prank, some kind of Chris Angel illusion, it had been amazing. But what really bothered me the most was I had taken my eyes off the figure for perhaps 3 seconds tops, just to pick up my phone and raise it. How had the figure in the mask known to move right when my eyes were averted? Could it really see me that well through the dark in a mask? And what were its intentions once it reached my car? I sat in silence in the car until my pulse returned to normal. I shook it off as best as I could and continued on my way. Needless to say, I never got a video. I never called the cops, or did any kind of investigating into the building or its history. Tomorrow night, I start driving back to DC, though I've decided to take a different route home. If you want to check out the building, feel free. Just don't blame me when you get arrested for trespassing or attacked by a gas mask wearing maniac. I'm not going to share my name, age, or location. I'm not writing this to entertain you. I'm writing this because I want to know if anyone else has experienced this, and if so, what can I do to stop it? I live in a gated apartment complex where the buildings form a square around an inner courtyard. Inside the courtyard is a grassy lawn area with a playground for kids and picnic tables. About 2 years ago, I was sleeping peacefully one night when a bone-chilling scream started coming from somewhere outside from within the courtyard. It was a tortured scream, like someone was being burned alive. But honestly, my ears were ringing so badly, and my adrenaline was pumping so hard. That was just an educated guess. The screaming was almost non-stop, with barely detectable pauses where the person took a breath. I heard people from all around the apartment building stepping out onto their balconies, trying to figure out what was going on. I went to my window and glanced outside. There was no lights on in the courtyard, but at least one tenant was shining a flashlight down from a window above, trying to find the source of the screaming. Each building is 3 stories tall, and I live on the ground floor apartment directly across from the mailboxes and the entrance. So if and when the police arrived, I would be the first to encounter them when they made their way out to the courtyard. I left the window and ran down my hallway to the front door and looked out my peephole. I could hear the screaming, and it was making my blood freeze. It almost sounded like it had an echo behind it, like it was reverberating off the stone walls of a deep pit or a stone tunnel. But regardless, the ferocity behind it was the most terrifying thing about it. It sounded like some poor guy was having his limbs torn off. I waited by the door for perhaps 5 minutes. There was no signs of police sirens, and the screams never let up. From elsewhere in the apartment complex, I heard children crying and people yelling. One guy was screaming profanities, and I heard at least 2 other people down in the courtyard yelling. There was no way I was leaving the safety of my apartment. I stayed right where I was, waiting for the cops to arrive. Then suddenly the tone of the screaming changed. Something was happening. It started moving towards me. Whoever or whatever was wailing from outside was leaving the courtyard and heading in my direction. I felt my heart sink as the screaming grew louder, until it was echoing off the walls from the hallway outside my door. I pressed my hands over my ears and slid down the door, closing my eyes and praying for the screaming to stop. It was so loud, I felt the noise in my bones, like it was shaking my teeth. There came a frantic pounding at my door and I screamed, too terrified to stand up and glance through the peephole, afraid of what I might see. Then as soon as it started, it was over. I lay on my hallway floor sobbing, and my head was ringing from the noise. A crowd of people had gathered outside my door and were shouting at each other, demanding to know what had been going on. The police arrived about 5 minutes later, and after they had settled down the angry mob outside my door, there came a knock. Apparently, most of the other tenants assumed that either myself or somebody I knew was responsible. As the screaming had stopped right outside my door, I let the police search my apartment to prove to them that I wasn't hiding anyone. Then they took my statement. The courtyard was searched, and the security cameras were reviewed, but there wasn't any footage that showed anyone either leaving or entering. This has happened 5 more times since then, what I call the phantom screaming. There's no pattern as far as I could tell. There's no way to predict it. It starts in the dead of night, continues for several minutes, and always ends up right outside my door before it stops. Most of my neighbors blame me for it and hate me because they're convinced that there's some connection between the screaming and it always ending at my door. They claim that I've traumatized their children and have tried to get me evicted twice. but no concrete proof has ever come to light that I'm the one to blame. I've never tried to record the screaming, though I know plenty of other tenants have. Once, a man marched out into the courtyard when the screaming started and fired 3 shots from a handgun into the air, which didn't solve the problem and resulted in him being arrested. The first few times I was willing to write this off as a horrific joke, but after 6 times I concede. I believe it to be something paranormal, but not once has anyone ever spotted a figure entering the courtyard, even though security has been tightened. So, does anybody know what's going on? Does this thing want me, or connected somehow to my apartment? What do I do to fix it? Can I fix it? If anyone has any solutions, let me know. Even when the screaming isn't happening, I still lie awake at night sometimes in a cold sweat, because I can hear the tortured wails echoing in my head. Some of you may ask, why don't I ever look through the peephole? Well, I refuse to do that. In fact, I've covered the peephole with duct tape. I'm terrified at the notion of looking at this thing, whatever it is, directly in the eye. Before I tell my story, just know that I have this insane, irrational fear of looking out the window at night and seeing someone else staring back at me. It usually prevents me from looking out of windows when it's dark. Anyway, on with the story. This happened about 3 years ago. I was 15 at the time. It was late, around 12 a.m. My mom worked 3rd shift as a nurse. She's a single parent and I'm an only child, so I was always home alone late at night. No matter, I enjoyed the peace. My mother had recently lost the keys to the front door, so I would have to wake up early in the mornings and let her in. To stop myself from having to wake up and lose my oh-so-precious sleep, I would just leave the door unlocked. I lived in a small town in a nice neighborhood, and crime was never a serious discussion. But that night changed everything. I remember going into the kitchen, making a bowl of cereal and playing with my cats. I'm standing in the living room at this point, when I hear a scratching sound at the door. The wind was blowing that night, making all sorts of sounds outside, so I didn't really pay it any attention. For some reason though, I decided to eat my cereal over the sink, in the kitchen, only a few feet away from the front door. This is something I would normally never do. My cats, upon hearing the scratching sound, run to the door. I roll my eyes, thinking that they're no fun to play with, but the scratching sound continues. Then my stomach just drops. I can't even explain the feeling that I got. It was like my intestines just fell further down into my body. It was then I realized that it wasn't the wind making the scratching sound. I walked to the door and decided to peek through the blinds, just in case there would be someone out there. We had a French door with a glass window in the middle, with blinds covering the whole. I peeked through the blinds, and to my horror, I see the glimmering whites of 2 eyes staring back at me. I see the rugged exterior of a man's face, and the striking outline of his nose, the coy grin on his lips. But the eyes. I will never forget those eyes. I dropped my bowl, which shattered on the floor, and quickly turned the deadbolt. Just as there was a sudden crash on the other side, the man was trying to break in. I rammed my feet against the wall, practically laid down on top of the door, and was able to shut and lock the deadbolt. I locked myself in a closet, called the police, and then my mom. The police showed up but didn't find anything. Nobody knows who it was. The most terrifying thing is that I usually listen to my iPod on max volume. So this guy could have easily just walked into my house and harmed me in some way, and I would have never known that he was inside. My bedroom was also at the back of the house, far away from the front door. I usually can't even hear the doorbell when it rings, so I would have been done for if I hadn't taken my cereal over to the sink that night. The thought still makes me sick to this day, and I still can't look outside my window at night for fear of once again seeing those eyes staring back at me. A few years ago, me and a friend of mine were driving around the back roads of Nebraska. It was summer break, and out of boredom, we decided to drive around and look for some old abandoned buildings to explore. We had been driving for an hour or so, and we passed by a few houses already, but we thought we spotted a building or something in the trees, and as we got closer, we discovered it was a small shed, and just up the path from this shed was this small rundown house. It looked like the perfect place to explore. As we were pulling in, we noticed something lying in the middle of the driveway. It looked like an animal carcass. It looked to be some kind of pig. As we parked the car, we noticed that there was more animal carcasses surrounding the house. maybe around 15 to 20 of them, just lying in the yard around the house. I should mention at this point that my friend and I were kind of tipsy, and seeing all these animal carcasses just excited us even more. We got out of the truck and started to walk up to the house. My friend wanted to see the inside of the house, but I wanted to explore the outside a bit more, so I said I would meet him inside. I walked around for a little bit, but it wasn't long until I spotted something that made me run back to the truck. In the yard was a pile of bones. When I first saw it, I thought it was just only animal bones, but upon closer inspection, I swear that I saw human skulls in the pile. I almost vomited, then made for the truck, screaming my friend's name. As soon as I closed the door, my friend came tearing out of the house as fast as he could. He had a look of pure terror and disgust on his face. He jumped in, started the truck, and sped out of there as fast as we could. When we got a little further down the road, he stopped the truck and told me what he saw. In one of the rooms of the house were numerous dead animals nailed to the walls. When he backed out of the room and into the hallway, he looked beside him. He noticed something in the darkness of the far end of the hallway. Standing there was a figure of a very large man. My friend was frozen in terror, and that's when the figure moved towards him, taking giant thudding steps. As the man moved closer, my friend heard the sound of metal dragging across the old floorboards. My friend did not wait to see what the man was dragging behind him, and booked it out of there. We somehow managed to find our way back. I told my friend about what I saw, and we decided to contact the police. But we couldn't remember specific roads we had turned off of, and couldn't give an accurate location. So long story short, there was no follow-up on our report. I don't know what was going on there, but I'm glad we got out of there when we did. I sometimes tell myself that I was just hallucinating when I saw those skulls, but I know deep down that isn't true. It started several years ago. Me and my friends were interested in urban exploration. I was a junior in high school at the time, which was when everyone started to earn a lot more freedom, so we took the chance to be out late whenever we could. Now keep in mind that I live in a major city in central Colorado, so the nightlife is never lacking. We could always find something to do, and we were especially interested if there was an element of danger. We wouldn't always plan these trips, but we made sure as hell that if we were going into an old building in the dark, we would have a knife and a flashlight for safety. We never really had to defend ourselves, but we came very close one evening. It must have been around November, because there wasn't yet snow on the ground, but it was very chilly that evening. Directly across the street from an abandoned hospital is another hospital that is newer and in use. The two are connected by an underground tunnel, which I can only assume was a way to move the bodies without alerting the other patients. This was a common trait among old hospitals. We have been inside the hospital a few times but never found anything strange, only the occasional sign of others having been or lived there. What was piquing our interest that night was the abandoned library next door to that hospital. It was also connected, but only by its exterior walls. To get inside, you could not cut through the hospital, but instead would have to hop over the tall wall and climb a very high fence. A few of us had backpacks containing the aforementioned safety precautions, and a couple of bottles of water, so nothing too heavy or valuable that would get damaged when tossed over the obstacles before us. A little ways off the road, it was dark if you clung to the buildings. We did that for a while, before stepping behind a small patch of shrubbery, which we determined was an easy way over the first wall, since the only other way to gain access was by a chained, unclimbable gate at the bottom of a set of stairs facing away from the ledge. Both were parallel with the library, so when tucked back in that corner behind the bushes, no one could see us from the street. I don't believe I went first, but I did not remain behind to be the last one over the wall. It was too high up for me to jump and haul myself over, so I resorted to stepping on a pipe jutting out somewhere lower along the wall. It gave me a needed boost, and soon I was up and over, moving into the library's courtyard. Another girl and I waited for our other two friends to join us. Upon an initial glance over the courtyard, there was no obvious way in. To our right was a dilapidated fountain, and the earth at our feet was cold and hard. There were no signs of another soul for years, except for the 15-foot chain-link fence directly in front of us, separating the courtyard in half. I could tell it hadn't seen the same weather as the rest of the courtyard, because the metal showed no signs of rust. That must be our way in. We agreed. Because with a fence like that, someone obviously wanted to keep us out. We hurled our bags over the fence, hearing them clank on the ground rather silently due to their lightness. I was the third over because I have a slight fear of climbing, and it took me a bit to mentally prepare myself. I made it to the top of the fence in short time, then sat at the top straddling it with a leg on either side. I had 2 girls on the other side in front of me and one behind me, telling me to hurry up. I spent a couple of minutes up there doing more mental preparation and some deep breathing, then climbed down to wait for the last girl. At the time, I was thinking that had been one of the scariest things I've done in a while because I tend to avoid climbing at all costs. Of course, this was only an irrational fear, as I have never fallen, but that phobia didn't even compare to what happened next. The last girl's feet hit the ground, and all 4 of us split up in the smaller half of the courtyard, looking for any kind of entrance. We decided that breaking a window would be too loud and draw unwanted attention, not to mention we could easily get caught up, so that wasn't an option. Searching for a little longer, we didn't find anything that looked remotely plausible, until we found a grate near the base of where 2 walls met. I couldn't believe that we hadn't noticed it before, and upon closer inspection, the grate was already moved slightly from its resting place, so it would be easy to lift the rest of the way. The smallest and least fearful of the group went first. After moving the grate, there was a small drop down. It was more than 3 feet down and 2 feet wide, but inside was another drop down, where we could see into the library's basement. She hopped down onto the small, square landing, only to almost immediately freeze. We looked amongst ourselves, wondering what was wrong. "There's a guy down there," she said. "What? Where?" "I can see his outline." I leaned forward and tried to make out a shape, but it was further down than my line of sight permitted, and it was too dark. "Hello?" she called out. He responded the same, asking us who we were. "Just a couple of girls," she spat out nervously. What he said next sent chills down my spine, and it was as if I could feel the darkness resonating out of that hole in the ground. All of a sudden, it was very still and quiet. He said in what I can only describe as a lustful tone, dripping with intent,
"I'm addicted to following the sound of women's voices."
My friend looked over at us blankly, but I could tell she was nervous. Something in his voice sounded like it wasn't an empty threat, like he wasn't just saying something creepy just to get us to leave. She looked back down to where he was and said, "That's not cool." The man started laughing maniacally. It wasn't in the way a really good actor does. It was in the way that we could feel his utter insanity hit us like stale air. We looked at each other for what felt like hours, but I knew it was only a couple of seconds, because we all knew without saying anything that we had to get out of there. And now, I wasn't about to risk some nutcase coming after us, even if we did outnumber him. My friend scrambled up out of the landing, and I was never over a fence faster in my life. 15-foot potential fall, and I didn't even have time to think about it. We didn't stop running until we were all in the street and halfway down the block out of breath. Even to this day, I can still hear that man's laughing. In the mid-1980s, my mom was a cleaner in Australia. She would do houses in suburban areas, and sometimes would go out to houses in rural or wine areas. We lived near both. She would leave business cards at the local shops, and she got most of her business that way, and some through referrals and word of mouth. One day she got a call from a lady who sounded like she was around 60, asking Mom to clean her old farmhouse. She made lots of odd demands, and Mom would usually meet clients before taking on new business. In this case, the lady did not want to meet Mom, and said that she would leave the keys under the front doormat. Mom agreed, mainly because this lady was quite obviously wealthy, and was offering to pay Mom substantially more than she would expect. Mom went to the house on a Monday morning, and said that she already felt unnerved by the long driveway. The house was essentially in the middle of a very large and very empty property. She found the keys and started cleaning. About an hour into the cleaning, she hears the back door shut. Mom was told that no one would be at the house, so she immediately felt unsafe. She stood frozen in the kitchen for what she said felt like 3 to 4 minutes, although she said it could have been much longer. There was no other car on the property. She wanted to leave immediately but had 2 more rooms left to do. Both were bedrooms. She said as time passed that she heard nothing else. She decided that perhaps it was nothing, or perhaps something had fallen, and it wasn't the door after all. She walked up the hallway and stepped into the bedroom. All over the bed were black and white photos. As Mom got closer, she realized that the photos were all of her. Some were taken at our family home, and many others were taken at houses Mom would clean, some through windows or over fences. She used the house phone to call the police and immediately drove to the end of the driveway. The lady ended up being investigated, but continued to claim that it was a break-in. After some time, the police stopped with their searching, and we ended up moving to a new town 4 months later. Every time Mom tells me the story, I get serious chills. My mom thinks that the lady had something to do with it, but why? And for what purpose? I am 22 and this incident happened a 1.5 years ago. I had just moved into my first apartment. The door that led to my apartment locks itself automatically when closed, so I was going to the entrance of the apartment complex to get my mail while talking on the phone with my boyfriend. I returned to my apartment and sat on the bed while opening the mail and using the phone. I dropped the phone on the floor and it landed under the bed, so I had to lie on the floor and stretch for it. I saw something that caught my eye. There was someone under my bed. My eyes widened and I choked the urge to scream. The person under my bed was lying still, with his back towards me and his head to his chest, so I couldn't see his face. He didn't see me. Trying to be rational while so many thoughts were rushing through my head, I picked up the phone and said, "Sorry, I dropped my phone. I'm just gonna take a shower and call you back." The bathroom was right next to my bed, so I quickly walked in, quietly locked the door, and turned the shower on. My apartment was on the first floor, so I jumped out of my window and then called the police. They told me to wait nearby, but to go across the street and see if anyone comes out of the door to the apartment complex. This was during the summer, and it was still light out. I placed myself across the street, hiding behind a car, while watching my open bathroom window and the entry door. I called my boyfriend, and he came to me just before the police. I gave them my keys, and they went inside. Only moments later, 2 cops came out holding a thin and tired-looking man. His eyes looked crazy, but he didn't try to get away. The policeman that stood beside me while the other cops searched through my house told me that the man stood outside my bathroom door with one of my kitchen knives and was waiting for me to come out. This man had somehow crept in my entry door, and while I was getting my mail, hid under the bed. The man was trying to hurt me and turned out to be a homeless person and ended up being placed in a mental hospital. My boyfriend moved in with me the very next day. I wanted to share my story so that others might know what to do if they find themselves in a situation like this. The police told me that what I did was truly amazing and rational, and if I screamed, this could have ended really badly for me. This is a popular story with my family and most of my friends. Amanda is my brother's girlfriend, and at the time of this story, she was looking for her first apartment and moving out from her parents' house. Her and my brother didn't want to move in together just yet, since they had only been dating for a few months. She opted instead to search for a roommate online. Browsing Craigslist, she found an ad titled, "Roommate Wanted, Females Only." This sort of thing was common, since the area that she was looking in was mostly young professionals. The listing was for a room in a house for about $225 a month, which was quite cheap compared to most places listed. The occupant listed herself as a 23-year-old college student that was not comfortable living with any males. The other roommate would have their own room and attached bathroom. So far, Amanda was into this place. However, the listing only had a single photo from outside the property. Amanda sent an email wanting to meet the occupant and tour the house. Within 30 minutes, she receives an email back with all the details and time to stop by. The girl worked late hours and wanted Amanda to stop by around 8 p.m. When Amanda arrives, there was a handwritten note on the front door saying, "Door broken, use back door." Walking around the house, it looks nice but slightly unkept. Tall grass, weeds, dusty windows, etc. Still no alarms for Amanda though. When she knocks on the back door, an older man opens the door. At first, Amanda thinks that she's at the wrong house, but the man reassures her and says that the occupant was out and that he was the landlord. The occupant asked him to meet Amanda since she was working late. He seemed pleasant and offered to show her around. Alarms start going off. First, the guy was clearly in his 40s, unshaven, and looked like he lived in his car. Also, only the kitchen light was on. As they walked around the house, Amanda noticed one huge red flag. There was no furniture. There was nothing. The landlord was polite about answering questions, but seemed irritable to keeping lights on for too long, rushing her around and only letting her look at rooms for a few moments. There was a single room that the landlord would not open, telling her that it was the occupant's room and he didn't want to invade her privacy. As they walk down the hallway and into the living room, she notices that the front door has a plank nailed across it. Amanda's creepometer had started dinging, so she decides to wrap things up, but trying to be polite. As she's telling the guy thanks for showing me around, he perks up and states that he forgot to show her the basement, that it was recently furnished and would be a great rec room, and that she should take a look down there. Amanda and the landlord are standing in a small hallway between the front living room and the back kitchen. In this little hallway was the basement door. When he opens the door, it opens outward, creating a barrier between Amanda and the back door. The basement is pitch black. He smiles and motions to the stairs and says,
"Ladies first."
What happens next is nothing more than a stroke of luck. Amanda got a text just as some random person parks in front of the house. Thinking on her feet, she pretends it's a phone call and answers her phone. "Hey, yeah? Are you here? I'll come out from around back and let you in. It's great. You have to see it." With a motion of confidence, she excuses herself around the landlord and walks out of the back door. She says the guy just looked at her like he was confused. Once outside, she sprinted to her car and sped like hell out of there. When Amanda got home, she told my mother and my brother everything. The cops were called. They took her statement and went to investigate. The Craigslist ad had been removed. The house had been foreclosed upon over 6 months earlier, and the property had been abandoned. When the police investigated, they found that the closed room that the landlord didn't want her to look in was where the man had been staying. There was a pile of old dirty blankets, rotten food, and empty gasoline jugs everywhere. What was even more creepy was that he had plastered ripped up pages from porno magazines on all the walls in the room. The really scary part was the basement. The man had tied a thin piece of fishing twine at about shin level across the stairs about halfway down. The basement was empty except for another pile of old blankets, a broom handle wrapped up in leather belts, and a small box with a few rolls of assorted tape. Needless to say, Amanda ended up not moving in. Several years ago, I went on a carnival cruise with my best friend. I was 30 at the time, and I had just had my heart broken after my fiancé had canceled our wedding, having admitted he only proposed to me to make some other girl jealous. I had just spent a small fortune on a full back tattoo of angel wings, and I had intended to flaunt them around shamelessly. My friend and I spent most of our time out on the sun deck, catching some rays and working on our tan, more often than not drinking whatever alcoholic beverage was closest at hand. My friend was determined to get me laid, as I had been faithful to my ex-fiancé for over 3 years, and she wanted me to immediately jump back into the game. I was pretty indifferent towards that idea, mostly because I was really enjoying the feeling of being free and detached, but I told her if she found a candidate, I would consider him. For the first few days, she didn't mention it, but on the 4th day she pointed out a guy who looked close to 40, with a well-kept beard, and get this, an eye patch. But he had the body of an athlete and reminded me of a young Kurt Russell. At first, I was ready to dismiss him out of hand because of the eye patch alone. Simply, it's not something I look for. But my friend kept insisting he was checking out my back tattoo as he walked back and forth across the deck. We never saw him with any other girls, and my friend kept insinuating he may have been a veteran, freshly back from duty and looking to get laid. I only made eye contact with him once, and he smiled and nodded in a warm and courteous way. I nodded back, but ultimately decided that even though he seemed like he would certainly help me forget about my ex, I wasn't interested enough to pursue it any further. I told my friend that he was all hers. The next day, I hit the hot tub by myself. I had my head back and was more or less zoned out. My eyes were closed and I was enjoying the blissful relaxation when I felt something poke into my stomach. I opened my eyes and noticed a single rose floating in the hot tub with me. Its stem was poking at me as it bobbed up and down. I glanced around, and there was plenty of people nearby, but on the complete opposite end of the deck, I noticed the eye patch guy was staring at me as he sat alone at a table. He waved at me, and I tossed the rose out of the water and climbed out, ignoring him. As I wrapped a towel around myself, I was annoyed. Looking back, that seemed like a stupid thing to do. The rose had thorns and they could have stuck me. Why not just drop the pellets in the tub, or leave the rose on my towel? Those both seemed like much more romantic gestures, even though they really wouldn't have impressed me much anyway. I figured that my friend must have colluded with him to play a joke on me, and I forgot the whole thing. I didn't see him again that day, or any of the next, though I mostly spent the time in my room. On the second to last day of the cruise, I was eating breakfast in the dining area when I felt a pair of hands start massaging my shoulders, and a voice behind me said,
"There's my angel."
It was the eye patch man. I leapt up and smacked his hands away, which caught the attention of several people sitting nearby. I told him to back off and to never touch me again. Then I stormed out of the dining room. I confronted my friend and told her to reel in her new boy toy, as he was starting to act way too familiar with me. She looked at me and told me that she had never once spoken to that guy. Knowing that she wouldn't lie to me, my stomach sank, and suddenly I felt very uncomfortable. Deciding not to go anywhere else alone for the remainder of the cruise, my friend and I stayed close together and enjoyed the rest of our day. After dinner, we returned to our cabin to notice a line had been drawn across the outer door frame in black marker, which I thought was weird, but was too buzzed to comment on. I stripped off my clothes and climbed into bed, and within 5 minutes I had passed out. I woke up already feeling the start of a hangover setting in, maybe around 40 minutes later. My friend was asleep in the bed next to me, and I was convinced that I heard a noise coming from the other side of the door. I got up to walk across the room to glance out the peephole, and noticed the eye patch man was right outside our door and was fiddling with the handle. There was a small globe sitting on the table next to the door with a heavy brass stand. It was meant to be a paperweight, but it also served as a mini lockbox which held my license, passport, and car keys. Without hesitating, I picked it up, flung the door open, and even before he could get a good look at my birthday suit, I smashed him directly in the face with the globe, right under his good eye. He cursed loud enough to be heard across the boat and took off running. I slammed the door, locked it, set the globe down, and got back into bed. I was asleep maybe 10 minutes later, and my friend never even stirred. The next day after we docked, I noticed him on the gangway, but he didn't even see me. He was bandaged up pretty good, and it looked like I had possibly broken his nose. My friend and I laughed our asses off on the ride home, and that's the story of how I knocked some sense into some creepy one-eyed stalker by stepping up and being my own guardian angel. I guess I'll never know exactly what his deal was, and I'm still not entirely sure if the marker on the door had anything to do with him, though the rooms did have numbers too, so who knows. I'm sure there's perfectly nice guys out there with eye patches, but this guy did not help the stereotype. Back in the second week of September, I took a short vacation to Hawaii with my boyfriend. The trip was very important to us because it was the only time both of us could arrange our work schedules to get off at the same time. Overall, the trip was incredibly fun and worthwhile, and we made the most of it by visiting Pearl Harbor, the Stairway to Heaven, and the Kona Brewery. We even got some skydiving in, which is something I'm very proud of myself for experiencing. We stayed at an Airbnb on the top floor of a high-rise with a spectacular view of the city, and we practically felt like we were living in our own private slice of the sky. Well, perhaps we shouldn't have felt so untouchable. On the second or third day of the trip there, we were enjoying a relaxing morning of testing the mattress. The curtains were wide open and the sun was pouring in. Our sensual bliss was suddenly interrupted when my boyfriend looked towards the window. Babe, there's someone out there." "Out where?" I turned my head towards the window, and I felt my insides shrivel away and die. There was a man with a dark tan, standing outside on a platform, staring right in at us, not even pretending not to notice what we were doing. Had I ingested enough booze, I may have just laughed and waved at him. But it was too early in the morning, and mortified, I hid under the covers while my boyfriend walked over and shut the curtains. Needless to say, it killed the mood. Killed it so badly, in fact, it was dead and buried about 10 feet beneath Moses. For a few awful minutes of shock and embarrassment, 1,000 questions raced through my mind. Like how long he had been out there. Was he recording anything? But most important of all, what was he doing out there? My boyfriend and I eventually made peace with the idea that he was probably a window washer or something, and we had just been unlucky. Had this been a hotel, we probably could have called down to the front desk and complained. But it was an Airbnb rental, and technically a private residence there. There was nothing we could do except laugh and shrug it off, which was exactly what we ended up doing. We eventually left the room and went about our day and had a great time, and I can honestly say I didn't think twice about the guy all day, as we enjoyed the sights and each other's company. And when we got back to the room, we picked up where we left off and had a good night's sleep. The following day we spent some time on the beach, but instead of heading directly back to the room afterwards, we went directly up to the roof of our building to see the view and take selfies. We took loads of pictures, watched planes take off and land from the airport in the distance, and overall just enjoyed the sensation of being young, in love, and in Hawaii. That's when, yet again, the moment was ruined. My boyfriend was out closer to the edge of the building, trying to get the best shot possible of the city, and I was sitting closer to the access door, enjoying the sun and minding my own business, when I heard the door swing open and I glanced over. The exact same guy who had been outside our window gave me a crooked smile, nodded and disappeared through the door and down the stairs, the door closing behind him before I could find my voice. My blood froze. Had that really just happened? How long had that guy been up there on the roof with us? What was he even doing up here? He wasn't dressed as a maintenance guy. And what's more, his right foot had been encased in one of those medical boots, which implied he wasn't working in any capacity. I had noticed it the other day when I made eye contact with him through the window. Part of me just wanted to run after him and grab him by the throat and ask him what the heck he was doing stalking us like that. But I'm a pretty small person, and realistically acting like that would have probably ended worse for me than him. I called my boyfriend over and gave him the rundown on what had just happened. He booked it over to the door and looked down the stairway, but the guy was already gone. What do you think he was doing? We'll report him to the security guard downstairs in the lobby. He probably lives in the building. But then we would have to admit that we were up here on the roof too. Eventually we just went back to the room without reporting him. We locked up our door tight, and the rest of our evening passed without incident. The next morning around 6 a.m. I woke up, rolled over in bed, and tried to fall back asleep. After maybe 5 minutes of just lying there quietly, I began to hear a noise coming from the outside hallway, through the living room. I sat up in bed and listened. There was a shuffling sound, and I wondered if some building administrator was sliding something underneath the door. Then I felt the door handle jiggle, and I suddenly was terrified. Like I said, this wasn't a hotel where room service may have just mistakenly been stopping by. This was supposed to be a private residence. I got out of bed without waking my boyfriend and crossed the living room to the front door. Outside, I suddenly heard the shuffling stop, and then there came the sound of soft, uneven footsteps heading down the hallway. I braced myself, looked out the peephole, but I didn't see anything. Had the person outside heard me coming, I double-checked the locks and headed back into the bedroom. The uneven footsteps unnerved me quite a bit, because all I could picture was the prowler guy trying to get in and possibly get a closer look at my boyfriend and I in bed. Despite my unease, I fell back asleep after about maybe 10 minutes. I woke up again around 7:30. There was much more sunlight in the room. My boyfriend was awake and on his phone. I kissed him good morning and made to get out of bed. "Hey, did you hear anything weird last night?" He glanced over to me, and I saw the hesitation in his eyes. "Not last night, but I woke up about 15 minutes ago to the sound of tapping on the window." My stomach sank. I stared at my boyfriend for a moment, and then we both climbed out of bed and threw back the curtains. I gasped and I covered my mouth. There were 2 faint handprints pressed against the outside of the glass, right about the spot where the curtains were closed, which implied to me that he had pressed himself against the window and tried to peek in, possibly without any harness. Just to get a look inside our bedroom terrified me. My boyfriend and I immediately went downstairs and told security, who obviously didn't believe us until we asked them to take a look at the handprints. We told them everything about the man in the boot watching us, and even us being up on the roof. After about a 40-minute conversation with security, we left to get some breakfast, and we never saw that guy again. I'm not sure if the building's security ever found him and put a stop to it, or he just stopped on his own, but we were fortunate enough to be able to enjoy the rest of our trip without incident. We even left a shining online review for Airbnb. While I'm still slightly creeped out, I'm so glad I got to spend some time in Hawaii with my boyfriend, and I don't regret the trip at all. This guy in the boot has given me a creepy story I can tell for years. Don't let this one random guy dissuade you from vacationing in Hawaii. It's well worth the trip. I would vacation there again and even stay in the same room. But if there ever comes a day where I read online that a guy fell to his death outside that building, I wouldn't be surprised, and I won't have to look at the picture to know who it is. I was roughly 8 or 9 at the time of this incident. I remember the attachable LCD screen for the PS1 had just come out, which would put this around 2001. My mother, older brother, and I took a trip one afternoon to our local Toys R Us. My brother and I would typically skip the rest of the store and head straight for the video game section. I guess my mom thought the store was safe enough to leave us in that area while she looked around. The section was well lit and had its own checkout counter and attendants. It would have been very stupid for a potential creeper to attempt to grab a kid under those circumstances, but some of these sickos tend to premeditate about all of this. So my brother and I split up to check out the newest games, and after a few minutes I noticed that someone was talking to my brother, someone who definitely was not an employee. He was a tall Caucasian guy with a slim build, gray hair, buzz cut, and seemed to be in his 40s or 50s. They talked for a bit and then the guy went about his business. I went up to my brother and asked him what the man wanted. My brother was more quiet than usual and simply stated that the man had offered to buy him anything he wanted from the store if he did the man a favor in return. When I asked what that was, my brother did not respond. As a kid, I guess I couldn't fathom the man's true intentions and merely thought he genuinely was going to buy a gift and leave us alone forever. The only thing running through my head was to grab the most expensive game console and find the guy again. I was very naive. Anyways, my brother knew better. He grabbed my arm and told me to forget about it. As we walked towards the car a little while later, I looked at the adjacent street and spotted the man. I pointed towards him and told my mom about what happened. He was staring right back at us as he drove away in his Jeep, possibly still reeling from almost getting caught. Looking back, I'm glad the man hadn't approached me instead. Last Thanksgiving, my boyfriend and I loaded our 2-month-old daughter into our car and drove from Miami to Naples to visit my family. Being new parents, we were extremely nervous about taking such a lengthy trip with a baby and packed for every possible scenario. We left shortly after 12, my boyfriend behind the wheel, and we hit the highway, which was swollen with holiday traffic. After about an hour of driving, the baby became fussy, and we pulled over at a rest stop to feed her and change her diaper. While I was changing her, my boyfriend stood outside the car stretching, and suddenly called my name. Peering outside the car, I looked across the street in the direction he was pointing. There was a clown with a purple star painted over his face, and wild, crazy, unkempt black hair, and a purple and white checkered outfit standing on the opposite side of the parking lot, just waving to people as they pulled in and out of the rest stop. I chuckled and returned to what I was doing, unbothered by the clown, figuring it was just part of some kind of promotion. As we pulled out of the station, the clown waved at us, and I gave a lazy acknowledgement back. Just before my boyfriend took his foot off the brake and eased into traffic, the clown gave me the most hungry, sinister smile I had ever seen, and shouted,
"You would look amazing draped over my lap."
Even through the closed car window, I heard him clearly, and said, "Wow, what a creep." As we drove away, I repeated what the clown had said to my boyfriend, who hadn't quite heard it, and for a few minutes he was dead set on turning around to confront him. But I told him it wasn't worth it, as we still had a long drive ahead of us. We arrived in Naples shortly after 2:30, and by then, I had already forgotten about the incident and didn't even bring it up to my parents. We had a great time at my parents' place, and ended up leaving close to 11:30 at night, much later than we had intended to. My parents tried to convince us to stay, and while we had plenty of stuff for the baby, We hadn't packed any overnight things for ourselves, so we decided just to commit to the drive. We figured that there would be a lot less traffic, and it would take a shorter amount of time to get home. My boyfriend had been driving for about 45 minutes when he asked me if I wouldn't mind taking over, as he was having a hard time keeping his eyes focused. I told him to pull over at the next rest area, and I would take the wheel. After a few minutes, we see a sign for a rest area and pull into it. It wasn't the same rest stop as before. It had no bathrooms, vending machines, or anything. It was basically just a long parking lot, with one row of parking spaces which looped back onto the road. My boyfriend pulled the car into a spot, nose first, so it was facing a long chain link fence, and beyond it, there was just trees and a swamp. I couldn't see anything specific in the glow of the headlights. He put the car in park and left the engine running, and the lights on as he climbed out of the driver's seat. The baby started to fuss as soon as the car stopped moving, and after I climbed out of the passenger seat, I opened the back door to check on her. My boyfriend climbed into the passenger seat and immediately shut his eyes, after I confirmed that the baby was fine and would probably fall back asleep when we started driving again. I shut the back door and made my way to the driver's seat. That's when I heard the sound of the chain link fence rattling, and something being dragged across the metal links, steadily drawing closer. I turned in the direction of the noise, and for a split second, I only noticed the dark outline of a figure on the opposite side of the fence, until they stepped into the light of our headlights. It was the exact same clown from the other rest stop, except this time he had a large red stain splattered across his purple and white costume, and was dragging a broken beer bottle across the fence. He pressed his face directly into the gaps in the fence and smiled at me. He cackled,
"Hello again,"
and started making lewd gestures with his tongue. I was at a loss for words. It was so unbelievably surreal that I could only stare at him in disbelief and horror, not knowing whether I should be truly afraid or start laughing at the absurdity of it. My boyfriend launched himself out of the passenger seat and screamed, "Get in the car!" When he opened his car door, the baby started crying out, and the sound could be heard across the silent parking lot, and the clown immediately started singing in a grotesque, uneven voice.
"Rock-a-bye baby in the treetop. When the clown comes, the cradle will rock."
My parents had given us a set of fancy glasses for our dining room table. My boyfriend launched one directly at the clown. The glass shattered against the chain link fence and sprayed tiny razor projectiles all over. The clown hissed and immediately booked it to the end of the fence. My boyfriend and I jumped into the car, slammed the doors, and locked them. I threw the car into reverse and backed out of the spot, and as we put the car in drive, we saw the clown charging towards us across the parking lot. My boyfriend yelled at me to hit him, but I swerved to avoid him and floored it out of the lot and back onto the highway. For the next several minutes, my heart was racing, convinced that at any moment a speeding car would come up behind us and try to run us off the road, but fortunately that never happened. We were so shaken and traumatized that all we could do for the rest of the way home was ask each other over and over again, what the heck just happened? We could only speculate what the guy was doing out there at 12 a.m., dressed like a clown in the middle of the Everglades on Thanksgiving night. We considered that he was just trying to mess with people, but you would need some serious balls to pull that kind of stunt out there in the Everglades. The people that live around there don't put up with that kind of nonsense. And what was he even doing there? Just hiding behind the dark fence for a completely random car to show up so he could traumatize them? I don't know if the stain on his suit was actually blood, but he made us feel threatened enough that we felt justified throwing something at him. And seeing as how his response was to charge us, I suspect that his intentions were hostile. The fact that we had seen him earlier that day made the situation even worse, because it felt like he was stalking us. My boyfriend had a license to carry a gun, so all I can say is, it's a good thing that he wasn't packing that particular night. This Thanksgiving, we planned to stay home. Back during the height of the 2016 clown craze, where psychos were dressing up and wandering around rural and wooded areas, stalking and terrifying people, I was living in a very isolated and heavily wooded property in Connecticut. My driveway was so long that my house could not be seen from the road, and I never once had a problem with trespassers, so my kids were free to play outside in our yard whenever they wished. One afternoon, I was inside the house on a conference call when my 8-year-old daughter ran into the house, stating that there was a clown in our driveway. For the first several seconds, I was annoyed because I was convinced she was either playing a joke on me or just seeing things. I excused myself from the call and asked her what she was doing there, and she simply replied, "It's pointing at us." Something in the way she said that made a chill run through me, and I stood up and walked out of the front door and onto the front steps. My daughter pointed and I saw a figure in a pink and blue striped outfit standing by the tree line, waving and pointing towards my other 2 children who were still close to the house, but calling over to the clown, asking what it wanted. I immediately called my kids inside and locked my front door. I told them to stay put, grabbed my stun gun from its spot, and got into my car. I called my husband as I drove the car out of the garage and down the driveway, telling him what was going on, and he told me to keep the car doors locked and not to get too close. I decided, at least for the time being, not to call the police because it would have taken them a good half an hour just to get there, and by then, the clown would likely be gone. I didn't just want to disappear into the house and wait for this person to get bored. I wanted to confront him and tell him to stay away from my property and from my kids. The clown wasn't by the tree line when I left the garage, but I drove down the driveway, into the trees a short way, and saw him jogging away at a brisk pace. When he heard my car coming, he stopped and turned around and looked back towards me. He wasn't wearing a mask, but his face was heavily made up, complete with a clown nose. But what really shook me was that he appeared to be holding a croquet mallet in one of his hands. He waved at me before disappearing into the woods, and I slammed on my brakes and rolled down my window halfway, screaming at him to get the hell off my property. I floored it to the end of my driveway and drove back and forth in the hopes of finding a parked car with a license plate I could report, but there wasn't anything suspicious or out of place. I returned to the house to check on my kids, who were more amused and excited than afraid. Inwardly, I kicked myself for not taking a picture of the clown on my phone, just to have a record of it in case I needed to report it. I told my kids they had to stay inside for the rest of the day and figured that I would never see the clown again. Whoever it was had gotten his kicks, and certainly would not risk trespassing on my property again. The kids were asleep, and my husband and I were skimming through Netflix, and I got up to let the cat out. I'm not exactly positive on what I saw, but there was definitely something across the yard. I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye and thought I saw the shadow of something cast by the moon disappearing around the corner. I turned on all the outside lights, and my husband and I looked around, but whatever it was did not reappear. It could have been a deer, I suppose, but the reason I suspect it was the clown was because of the following morning. When I drove my car to the end of the driveway, there was a purple balloon tied to our mailbox, and the little potted plant at the base of the post had been smashed, as if something big, like a mallet, had come down on it. Worried that the balloon was an indicator of some kind, I immediately untied it. The rest of that day passed without incident, and by the following afternoon, I'd forgotten all about the clown until my kids came back inside and told me he was back and pointing at them again. I yelled at the kids to come inside, but this time, instead of getting in the car, I grabbed my phone and stun gun and stupidly charged out of the front door and stomped across the yard, determined to get a picture this time, and at best stun him and hold him down until the cops came and dragged his ass away. I never saw him that time, and instead of just keeping my kids shut inside, I loaded them in the car and drove to my parents. This time they were a little more spooked by the clown, and I began to become concerned that perhaps my kids were not safe in the yard anymore. I asked them if it was the same clown, and they said it was, and this time he was holding a sledgehammer. I don't know if that was true, or if they were just misidentifying the croquet mallet. The following day, I decided to become a little more proactive. My parents let me borrow their black Labrador named Groucho. He was a friendly dog, but had a tremendously loud bark and was fiercely protective of the kids. For 2 days, nothing happened, and I was starting to hope that the clown had moved on to harass someone else. That's when it happened. I was returning back up the driveway in the car after getting the mail when I noticed the clown was sneaking through the woods. Groucho was in the back seat and immediately started barking loud enough to rupture my eardrums. I slammed on my brakes and immediately called the cops and told them that there was a trespasser on my property and he was carrying a weapon. I honestly couldn't tell if he was carrying the croquet mallet through the trees, but I know he had been carrying one before, so I felt I had a reasonable cause to assume. As I was on the phone with the cops, another call came in on my cell from the house. My oldest daughter was crying, saying that there was a clown standing on our back deck, right outside the sliding door. This one was dressed all in orange, with a blue face. I floored it back up the driveway, threw my car into park, and when I reached the garage, I saw the second clown sprinting towards the woods. I opened the rear door, and Groucho tore after the guy like a ballistic missile. He caught the clown right by the tree line, and the guy started screaming as the loyal dog leapt on top of him and tore at his costume. I distinctly heard two separate male voices yelling in the trees, though I couldn't make out exactly what was being said. My daughter was still on the line and confirmed to me that all the kids were still inside, so I went after my dog into the woods. When I found Groucho, he was limping slightly. I was infuriated to see that he had been stabbed with what could have been an ice pick or a screwdriver, but he ultimately seemed unbothered by it. When the cops arrived, I gave them my statement, and they searched the woods. About an hour later, I got a call saying that two men had been pulled over and arrested several miles away for reckless driving, and one of them had severe dog bites on both legs. Groucho went to the vet and got bandaged up, and fortunately he has been perfectly fine ever since. I never heard any follow-up pertaining to the arrest afterwards, but the whole situation still amazes me. Getting to our house through the woods isn't an easy 2-minute hike. These men had to walk a good 10 to 15 minutes through the thick forest in full clown makeup just to get close enough to see our house, all for the sake of pranking and terrorizing my family, who was just minding their own business. Their motives were completely lost on me, and the more research I did on this whole clown thing, the more I think it was some kind of test or initiation, and not just something bored people were doing to pass the time. They put real effort into stalking us, and ultimately were rewarded with a dog attack. I think they got lucky. Fortunately, I've never seen another trespasser on my property since.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
Back in the 1970s, my uncle used to spend a couple of weeks in his hunting cabin that was in the middle of nowhere up in Canada. Most of the time his trips were very relaxing and enjoyable. He would head back home afterwards feeling refreshed, having unplugged from society for a bit. He used to tell me that he had some of the best moments of his life sitting on his front step, watching as the stars faded from the sky and the dawn appear on the horizon. He was a real man of the earth who enjoyed being one with nature. I'm surprised he never sold his condo and went full Amish. There was one year that nearly derailed his loner lifestyle and scared him so much he nearly sold the cabin and never went back. It's the most popular story circulated through my extended family, and the reason I always triple check my locks before going to bed. Now, for some context, the cabin wasn't accessible by vehicle, and there was a small amount of hiking involved to reach it. It was about 400 square feet and was made up of a single room. There was no running water and no electricity. It was a wooden structure built upon a small stone foundation, and because of this, there was about a 12-inch space between the ground and the floor of the cabin. There was a trapdoor by the fireplace where he would drop extra logs of firewood, so he wouldn't have to venture outside to collect more. The incident happened in October. It was extremely cold even by Canada standards. When he wasn't at the cabin, he had the front door locked with a padlock, but upon entering, the first thing he noticed was the hint of tobacco in the air. This confused him, because he didn't smoke, and he hadn't been in the cabin since January. But he shrugged it off and got himself settled in. His first order of business was to get a fire going. He lit the lanterns, unpacked, pulled up his chair to the fire, and fell asleep. He woke up several times during the night, always in a state of panic, as if the chair was tipping over and he was falling. But the wind was roaring so hard outside, and the cabin walls were creaking so much, he shrugged it off as paranoia. He eventually left his chair and got into bed. He awoke one more time that night. When dawn was just beginning to peek through the window, he shot up in bed when he heard a loud roar of the wind, and through his haze of sleep, he thought he saw a figure outside the window. He scrambled out of bed knocking over his chair, grabbed his hunting rifle and bolted across the room and flung open the front door. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, but there weren't any signs of footprints outside. He slammed his door shut, put down his rifle and muttered a few profanities as he righted his chair. He opened the trap door, grabbed a few more logs and put them on the fire, and then went back to bed. It should be noted that the lantern was burning low when he woke up, as was the fire, so there wasn't much light in the room. At about 9 a.m., my uncle woke up to the sun shining brightly through the cabin windows. He got up, warmed some water for coffee by setting the kettle down on the shelf over the fire, and then opened the front door. He said what he saw next nearly gave him a heart attack. There were footprints in the snow leading away from the cabin's front door. My uncle, being his normal impulsive self, threw on some clothes and boots, grabbed his rifle, and followed the footprints through the trees with his gun up, ready for confrontation. The footprints circled up the surrounding hills, and my uncle followed them to a spot where the entrance of the cabin was in plain sight. The intruder had clearly crouched for a long while, then the tracks made off at a good stride further into the woods. Based on the boot size of the footprints, the stranger was just as large as my strapping 6'3" uncle, if not larger, and was clearly expecting my uncle to notice his tracks and come after him, or else he wouldn't have stopped to watch the cabin. He would have continued to run and make his escape. My uncle didn't want to fall into any kind of trap, so he fired a single shot into the air as a warning, and made his way back to the cabin. Once inside, he locked the door and opened the trap door by the fireplace. As he poked his head down, he scanned the area under the cabin with a flashlight and discovered one of his own blankets in a dirty, tangled mess in the corner. There were a couple of empty soup cans he recognized from his own pantry, a single spoon, and several dozen small bones, most likely squirrels or rabbits. What my uncle thinks occurred was that somehow an intruder had broken into the cabin while my uncle was away and had been hiding under the floor the entire time he had been there the previous day. He came to the conclusion that the reason he kept being jolted awake the night before was because half of the chair had been resting on top of the trap door, and whoever was below was trying to escape by lifting the hatch. Later on, when my uncle thought he saw a figure outside the window, he later realized that the figure had actually been inside and was heading for the door, but was interrupted, and the man had likely leapt back down through the trap door when my uncle sprang to life and noisily knocked over his chair. The creepiest thing about all of this wasn't the fact that a complete stranger was hiding so close when my uncle thought he was alone. It was the fact he was hiding in the first place that really calls into question who he was and what his motives were. It was never confirmed how the man broke into the cabin, but was already under the floor when my uncle arrived, which tells me he was going to great lengths to make sure that he wasn't discovered. When he finally emerged from under the floor, he could have killed my uncle in his sleep, but he took the opportunity to run. It's possible that he simply decided that he didn't want to risk a struggle, but I think whoever he is, he was on the run, or at the very least, had something to hide. Earlier the same year in May, not very far away, a 17-year-old girl had gone missing while walking up the road to visit her cousins, and shortly after in August, a 21-year-old woman was found stabbed to death on the very same road the girl had disappeared on. I believe whoever was in my uncle's cabin could very well have had something to do with one or both of these unsolved crimes. My uncle never reported the incident to the police, and to the best of his knowledge, the intruder never returned. But it makes me wonder to this day, are we ever really alone when we think we are? Because if someone could be hiding under the floor in an isolated cabin during the winter, is it really impossible that there could be someone under your bed right now? Back in the early 2000s, I had just graduated from high school and was spending the first few days of summer camping out in the woods on my grandfather's property in Maine. I was with my two best friends, Heather and Kim, all of us being big outdoor enthusiasts who enjoy climbing up trees and lying out under the stars at night. On the second day of our camping trip, we decided to take our tent deeper into the woods so we wouldn't be able to see my grandfather's house anymore. We liked the idea of feeling alone and independent. After we set up the tent, we started a game of capture the flag, where we each had a different colored towel that we got to hide in plain sight, either up a tree or in a hole somewhere, and then we would search for our opponent's towel and try to get it back to home base, which was the tent. I wasn't very good at winning this game, and I was determined to go the extra mile this time. The rules were that the flag had to be visible enough so the color stood out at a short distance, but I was going to bend the rules a bit and hide the flag in a small cave I knew was nearby. Both girls were unlikely to venture too far into this cave to look. I had been to this cave several times and referred to it as Tiger Lily's Cave, like the character from Peter Pan. It was small and narrow, and you had to crouch to walk in. But I didn't mind risking the cobwebs in my hair. I went as far back into the cave as I could, and dropped the bright green towel on the ground, visible enough if you walked deep enough into the cave you would find it, when I noticed something. Just beyond the edge of the daylight, streaming through the entrance, I saw a glittering against the sun. I figured that it was a coin or something. I moved in to take a closer look. I discovered that it was a buckle on a strap of a man's suspenders. The end with the buckle was lying on the leaves, as motionless as a dead snake. The other end of the suspender was attached to the pants of a man's body, lying face down in the ground. His head was wrapped up tightly in a plastic bag. I shrieked and ran back outside the cave and kept screaming for my friends until they came running. I told them I found a body with a plastic bag over his head, and all three of us immediately went back into the cave. And in the semi-darkness, we all started speaking very fast and very loud, arguing whether it was real and how could it have gotten there. It was Heather who pointed out that this was a victim of murder and we had to get out of there as the murderer could return. We ran back out of the cave as fast as we could, while crouched over, and then sprinted back to my grandfather's house, who, go figure, wasn't even home. I called my mom from the kitchen phone, and she told us to call the police. By the time my mom, my grandfather, and the two policemen had all arrived, 40 minutes had gone by. We led them with much more confidence and excitement than fear back to Tiger Lily's cave, where I immediately noticed that the leaves had been disturbed. One of the policemen crouched down and wandered in with a flashlight, and after a few minutes called out to our group that there was no body, but plenty of dried blood, and clear evidence that something heavy had been dragged out. He emerged from the cave holding my bright green towel. There was a few smears of blood showing against the fabric. We immediately were sent back home. In the next 12 hours or so were a circus of people walking back and forth in and out of the woods. About a dozen more cops arrived with dogs to track whoever removed the corpse. I remember us all grilling out on the back deck and watching the cops walking in and out of the woods. A few of them even ate with us and filled us in on a few details. By the next day, most of them were gone. One police car was stationed on the street by my grandfather's driveway to keep an eye on things, but no reporters ever came to interview us, and we never heard anything about it on the news. I gave the best description of the body that I could, but given that it was dark and there was a bag over the man's head, the best I could do was describe the suspenders and shirt. After another week or so, the police released the scene, and we never heard from them again. We never found out what happened to the body or who dragged it away. My grandfather has since died, but his property was sold to a family I know very well, and since then I have taken my kids to the cave for them to explore. It's one of the most exciting and mysterious childhood memories of mine. Finding a body in a spooky cave in the Maine wilderness. That's the stuff Stephen King novels are built on. When I was 17, I had the extreme misfortune of breaking both of my legs at the same time. I had been playing football with some of my friends out behind my house in a wide open field. There was a barn that had been abandoned and was slowly rotting away. The way the barn was built, it was nestled right onto the side of the hill. So you could walk around the far end of the barn, climb up the hill, and walk onto the roof. I was being a bit of a dick during the game, and I deliberately ran through what we had marked as out of bounds and ran up the hill and across the barn roof, intending to leap down off of it and score a bogus touchdown. But due to the rain, the wooden roof beams were wet and soggy, and when the wood gave out under my feet, I crashed downwards through the ceiling and landed hard on some old farming instruments, including buckets, a set of horseshoes, and a spare tire for an old tractor. I'm actually pretty lucky that I didn't get impaled by a pitchfork or anything. To make a long story short, I broke both of my legs, dislocated my left arm, and had a concussion. I was rushed to the hospital and was discharged in a wheelchair, where I was forced to stay on the ground floor of my house. One night my parents and sister decided that they wanted to go see the new Lord of the Rings movie that was playing. And kind of without warning, they said they were leaving. I found myself in the house alone. At first, I didn't mind. I had complete control of the TV and could play my video games as loud as I wanted to. But before long, I got frustrated. Most of my games were upstairs where I couldn't get them, and couldn't reach the microwave or most of the higher cabinets from my wheelchair, so I was very limited on what I could do, and I began to feel very bitter. I rolled myself into the dining room without turning on the lights and peeked out into the backyard, out across the field and into the barn. I'm not sure why I wanted to look back there. It was dark out, and there wasn't much to see, but I'm the type of guy who always has to be aware of his surroundings in order for my mind to be at peace. I looked out at the stars for a few moments and was about to roll myself backwards and return to the kitchen when I saw something. By the light of the moon, I saw two figures walk out of the barn and make their way towards my house. I froze, too nervous to even let the curtain fall back in place. I made myself stare back towards the approaching figures. They weren't just walking, they were holding hands. I remember speaking out loud, "Are those kids?" I felt most of the fear melt away and was replaced by rage. Who were these brats trespassing on our property at 9 o'clock at night? We lived in a pretty secluded area, and it would have taken quite a lot of walking through the woods in the dark to enter our backyard from that direction. That's when I made my first mistake. I opened the window and called out to them, "Hey, what are you doing?" Both figures immediately stopped in their tracks, still holding hands, but otherwise keeping completely still. "Get out of our yard," I called out. There was perhaps 5 seconds of silence before one of them called out in a voice so calm it made all the terror and fear come rushing back. "Can we come in?" The voice sounded muffled, and at this point, my eyes had adjusted to the darkness. Now that I had a better look at them, I could tell that they weren't kids. I would say that they were probably teenagers, wearing white porcelain masks that had these sadistic painted smiles on them. My response died in my throat, and my hands began to shake. I slammed the window shut and wheeled myself fast back across the dining room and into the living room. I shut off the TV and lights, casting the house into darkness, and rolled into the den. I got out of my wheelchair and crawled across the floor to the window and peeked out. They were both at the same spot, still holding hands, still staring right at the house. I watched them for a few more seconds, and then one of them raised their hand and waved at me. Not in the general direction of the house, right at me. I ducked back and started freaking out and cursing. I hadn't turned on any lights. There was no way they could have seen half of my face peeking out at them from the distance in the dark. I had no idea what to do, and I didn't know if all the doors were locked, if the garage door was shut, or even when my family would be back home. I felt completely helpless, knowing that I didn't have the strength or ability to check every room in the house to make sure it was locked up tight. I went to the phone on my desk and frantically called my mom's phone, but her cell was off. She was likely in the movie. Same thing with my dad. I thought about calling the cops, but I didn't know exactly what to tell them. Sure, there was 2 people trespassing on my property, but they hadn't threatened me or attempted to break in yet. I didn't know how to put into words the sense of urgency and danger I felt. I crawled back to my wheelchair and rolled myself through the darkness and into the hallway that separated the living room and kitchen. That's when I heard a knock at the door, and I heard a muffled voice ask, "Can we come in?" I turned away from the front door and made my way towards the stairs, intending to climb them on my hands and knees, crawl to my room, and lock myself in there. My front door had a strip of narrow windows turning vertically down along the doorframe, and when I was nearly at the stairs, a masked face appeared through one of the windows, and shortly after I heard giggling. Upon making eye contact with the mask, the person crooked their head to the side. I froze like a deer in the headlights. All I could do was stare back. I remember it so perfectly. As I'm typing this, my hands are shaking. The mask disappeared from view, and that's when I noticed the deadbolt to the front door was unlocked. All anyone had to do was turn the knob, and they could walk right in. Then there was a knock on the back door, and another small muffled voice. I could barely hear what it said because of the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I shut my eyes and buried my face into my hands. I heard rattling coming from the back door. I'm not very religious, but in that moment, I prayed to whoever would listen. I'm not sure how long I sat there, crying, and waiting for one of the doors to open. But after what felt like 10 minutes, I looked up. There was no one peeking through the window at me. I slid out of my chair, crawled slowly to the stairs, and into my room, where I shut the door and locked it. I'm not positive about this last part, but right before I shut the door, I glanced down in the dark hallway, and I thought I saw the shadowy outline of a dark figure slowly tiptoeing up the stairs. I locked the door and proceeded to suffer through the longest night of my life. I never heard anything else from either inside the house or outside. My parents and sister arrived after 1 a.m., and by that time my shirt was soaked through with sweat. They thought by the look on my face I had suffered a stroke or something, and nearly called the ambulance for me. I never saw these masked people again. Of course, my parents didn't believe me. Why would they? There was no evidence that someone had broken in. It was just much easier for them to conclude that I just had a nightmare. My legs have since healed, and even though I still walk with a slight limp, there was otherwise no permanent damage. If I had to choose though, I would rather break both of my legs again, just to avoid the feeling of helplessness and terror that I felt that night when I looked into the hollow black eyes of that porcelain mask. This happened in October of 2014. I am originally from a small town, but I moved to a larger area in the Midwest for grad school when this happened. I rented a room and shared a house with other students near the university. It's an older 2-story house with a 1-story extension in the back, which serves as our living room. When you walk through the front door, there's a staircase immediately to the left, which goes up and to a hallway that turns right. In the hall, there's a bathroom to the left, and my room is at the end of the hall to the left. And there's 2 other rooms on the right side. At the time, I had 3 roommates, a girl that lived across the hall, and a guy that lived in the other room upstairs, and there was another guy in the downstairs bedroom. All of them were usually gone on the weekends. On the night in question, I was dating my girlfriend for a little over a month. It was a Saturday night and I picked her up in my car. We went out, had a few drinks, and we took an Uber home because I didn't feel comfortable driving. We got to the house and went immediately upstairs to my room. We were the only ones in the house. After me and my girlfriend had some intimate time together, we fell asleep. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper, but my girlfriend is not, and she nudged me awake to tell me that she heard a noise coming from the outside. I told her that it was probably some drunk people walking by, since we live close to campus, or maybe it was a raccoon or some other small animal. She seemed satisfied with that and tried to go back to sleep. Just then, we heard another noise, coming from the back of the house, and it didn't sound like people just walking by. I got out of bed and walked to one of my windows, which faced the back of the house, directly on top of the extension. I had the curtains and blinds down, but I peeked from around the corner and looked outside. My slight buzz and drowsiness went away immediately, and my heart was racing like crazy after I looked outside and saw the silhouette of a person climb onto the roof of the extension. My girlfriend saw my reaction and asked what was wrong. I immediately told her to grab a phone and go to Jessica's room across the hall, lock the door, and call 911, because there was an intruder on the roof of my house. My girlfriend did as she was told. Well, I slipped on a pair of gym shorts and shoes. I grabbed a kitchen knife that was on my desk after eating some dinner the night before, and I stood next to the window with my back against the wall and listened closely. I could hear the person walk along the roof, barely feeling his footsteps. Then I heard a noise and could tell that he was fidgeting with the bathroom window, which was right next to my room. Luckily, the window was locked. I tiptoed outside my room to the hall, waiting to attack if he broke the window, knowing that I had to protect my home and my girlfriend. I stopped hearing the noise coming from the bathroom window, and then started hearing a similar noise coming from my window, the one I was just standing next to. My heart was pounding. I gripped the knife tightly in my hand, mentally rehearsing on what I would do if he managed to break in. All of this occurred in just a few seconds, but I realized that maybe I could scare the intruder away and avoid confrontation completely. I took a deep breath and yelled, "I have a gun. Come inside and I will fucking shoot you." And I heard the thud of footsteps going away from the window and then the noise of gravel. I was sweating at this point. I walked outside my room and knocked on Jessica's door, telling my girlfriend it was me, and the intruder was gone. She unlocked the door and opened it, and I saw that she had been crying, I dropped the knife and hugged her and told her everything was going to be okay. Just then, I saw blue and red lights outside the window of Jessica's room, which faced the front of the house. I told my girlfriend to come with me so we could tell the police what happened. I walked downstairs, turned on the porch light, and unlocked the door, opening it slowly with my hands held up. The police were approaching with their guns drawn and saw me in nothing but shorts and shoes, drenched in sweat. I kept my hands high and told them that I lived here and that the intruder ran away out back. The police then said something into his radio, some code, and saying that there was a possible intruder on the loose, and he stood there with us while the other officer walked inside the house. I was told that he was going to check and make sure that there was no one inside the house. After what seemed like hours, but really was only a few minutes, I heard a voice over the radio. "All clear." We went inside, and one officer began to ask us questions, while the other looked around outside. After giving him our statements, the other officer walked back in and told us that it looked like the intruder had climbed on top of our garbage cans and then climbed onto our roof, because one of our cans was tipped over. Since the house was dark and there was no light outside and no cars in the lot, we had been victims of an attempted robbery. I asked the officer if there was any weapons that they might have left behind, and he said no. It was unlikely the intruder had wanted to harm anyone, as there had been a series of break-ins during the last several weeks around campus, with intruders mainly taking prescription drugs. He advised me to get a better weapon than a steak knife, and to keep the lights on inside and our windows locked, and to consider installing outside lights. I asked if he would fingerprint the window, but he said he couldn't, because nothing had been taken and no one was harmed, and most likely this person was wearing gloves. The police also told us that there were units searching the neighborhood, but it was unlikely they would find anyone, since I couldn't give a description of the person, seeing only a silhouette. Needless to say, my girlfriend and I didn't get much sleep that night. The next day, I called my landlord and told him what happened. The following day, we had a bright light installed in our back patio that turned on when it got dark automatically, and a motion sensor outside the window upstairs that shines brightly if anyone stands on the roof. Not content on just threatening a burglar with a gun, I went out and bought one, and I now keep it in my nightstand drawer beside my bed. I used to live in a 2-story house in Boise, Idaho. Both floors were meant to serve as a single bedroom apartment. I lived on the second floor, and the floor beneath me was vacant. I entered and exited the apartment through the back deck, and would walk down a wooden stairs to the driveway. There was a door in my living room that led downstairs to the second apartment, but it was deadbolted from my side. In turn, there was a door at the bottom of the stairs that was deadbolted from the other side. The entire time I lived on the second floor apartment, I never had anyone living underneath me. I would occasionally ask the landlord why that was, and he would always shrug and say that the building had a bad reputation. It had caught fire in the late 80s and 2 people had died downstairs. One extremely stormy evening, I was watching football in my living room when the power went out. I sighed and gathered some candles and a flashlight and decided that I might as well turn in early, even though it was only about 9 o'clock. I climbed into bed, but since I wasn't very tired, I spent a good hour tossing and turning. When 10 o'clock finally came around, I was about ready to get out of bed and just start making shadow puppets with my flashlight, just to pass the time, when I heard a door slam from somewhere in the house. I shot up in bed. I knew for a fact that I was alone in my apartment, and no one was supposed to be downstairs. The next second, I heard heavy feet charging up the stairs from the downstairs apartment, and someone had begun putting their way into the door that led into my living room. I leapt out of bed and grabbed my cell phone to call the cops. I locked myself in my bedroom and frantically told the operator that there was someone in the house trying to get into my apartment. There came a tremendous banging on the other side of the door, like someone was wielding a sledgehammer or an axe, trying to break it down. The operator confirmed that she could hear what was going on, and that the police were on their way. I stayed on the line for what felt like another hour, hysterically telling the operator who my parents were, and to tell them I loved them in case I died. In retrospect, I probably should have just grabbed my keys and simply leapt out of my bedroom window and into the driveway and floored it out of there in my car. But I wasn't exactly thinking straight. I was convinced that I was about to die. When the police arrived, their wailing alarms drowned out the noise of the thunder and rain. They breached the house from the ground floor, and I heard them beneath me screaming, "Police!" and the noise on the staircase abruptly stopped. I heard more of the policemen on the back deck, knocking on the glass of the sliding door, and I ran out of my bedroom to let them in. Before I could even ask if they caught the intruder, they quickly rushed me out of the house and into the rain, claiming that the house was on fire. I waited in a patrol car in my pajamas, pretty damn wet and upset as the policemen ran in and out of the building with flashlights. After the fire truck had arrived, a police officer got into the car with me and offered me a towel, and then started to ask me questions about the intruder. I told him all that I knew, which wasn't much. The officer then explained that upon entering the house, the bottom door of the stairs was deadbolted shut, as was my door at the top of the stairs, and there was absolutely no damage to either door. Upon entering the house, the officers were overwhelmed by the smell of smoke and immediately called the fire department, assuming there were flames raging inside the walls. Despite the smell, the firemen concluded that there was no fire anywhere, and besides myself, there was absolutely no evidence that anyone had been in the house. The landlord arrived shortly after, as I sat in my living room in the dark, drinking whiskey right out of the bottle, muttering about how I wasn't crazy. I definitely heard the sound of someone attacking the door. He told me that the previous tenants who lived downstairs had been a single father and his disabled son. One night, the son had accidentally set a fire to the carpet in the living room, and the father and son were both trapped in the stairway, unable to open the door to the second floor, and had died of smoke inhalation. I moved out the following month. For reference, I'm a 20-year-old male who weighs about 200 pounds. I live in a suburban area of a very large city which I won't disclose because if I did, it would make it extremely easy to figure out where I live. This experience happened to me about 2 weeks ago, and I'm still shaken up from it. I worked as a busboy on the weekends at a popular catering hall near where I lived. I'd been working there for a little over a month at that point, and it was actually my last day working there since I had another job that was offering me more hours with better pay if I was available to work on weekends. I had to work a party that lasted from 7 p.m. up until midnight, and I had to stay for almost 2 hours after the party was over to reset the room for the following morning. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, we finished resetting the room, and we were told we could leave. I was about to walk out of the building when my boss ran over to me and asked if I could help her move a table to the upstairs room, which I did. We placed the table where it needed to go, and then we both went back downstairs to leave. We walked outside and said goodnight to each other, as she got into the Uber car that she had requested to take her home. Now, due to numerous setbacks in my life, I unfortunately do not have my driver's license yet. The catering hall is only about a 30 to 40 minute walk away from my house, and I don't mind walking. But during my time working there, my parents were nice enough to drive me to and from work. My mom told me to call her when I got off work, and she would give me a lift home, as she didn't want me walking by myself that late at night. I gave her a call on her phone. It immediately went to voicemail indicating that it was off. I tried again, and the same thing happened. I thought to myself that she must have fallen asleep on the couch and forgot to put her phone on the charger, so it must have died. I called my dad hoping his phone wasn't on silent, as it usually was when he goes to sleep. As luck would have it, it must have been since I called his phone a few times and got no answer. Shit, I thought to myself. All my coworkers had left and I couldn't ask anyone I worked with for a ride home. And the only bus nearby that would cut my trip in half stops running at about midnight, so I couldn't take the bus home. I also didn't call an Uber since I forgot my debit card and only had 2 singles on me. Looks like I had to say fuck it and walk home instead. To give you some perspective, the catering hall was located in between a service road that runs along a major highway and a street that rides along the coast side. In order to get home, I had to walk down the service road for about 10 minutes until it hit the aforementioned coast side road, which went underneath the highway and out the other side. And then I would have to walk 2 more blocks up the road until it hits another street that I had to turn right on, and walk for about another 10 minutes, half of which is spent walking uphill, until I reached the street that entered the community I lived in. I began walking, and about 5 minutes later I pass a bar where I see a car idling in the parking lot, with only the left headlight shining. The car was a white Toyota Camry if I'm not mistaken, and there were 2 guys in the car smoking a cigarette. I quickly glanced over while passing by, and I didn't think much of what I saw. The bar closed at 1 in the morning, but I figured these guys just pulled into the parking lot for a quick smoke. I turned onto the road that runs underneath the highway, and was crossing the service road on the other side, when I get the sudden urge to look behind me. I quickly looked back to see the same car driving down the road I was walking along. It wasn't exactly pitch black, but it was still relatively dark enough where I might not have recognized the car if both headlights had been shining. I continued walking and eventually turned right onto the road with the hill I mentioned earlier. When they slowed down next to me and the passenger rolled down the window to talk to me, the road that I had turned onto was darker than the road I was walking on before, so I wasn't able to make out exactly what either of them looked like, but from what I could make out, they both were probably in their late 20s, wearing dark clothing. The driver was a white male and the passenger was a black guy. The passenger then rolls down the window and asks what I'm doing walking so late at night, to which I respond that I'm walking home from work. He then asked me,
"Would you like us to give you a ride home?"
I responded by saying, "That's very kind of you, but I'm fine walking by myself. Thank you for the offer though." He gets visibly annoyed. In a somewhat agitated tone, he says,
"Nah, man. It's dark and dangerous outside. You should let us give you a ride home. We'll get you there safe and sound. Come on, you can trust us."
At this point, the only things on the road were the car and myself. I decline once again and dart behind the car and walk across the street. I walk up and turn left into a parking lot of a different community that was about 2 blocks away from my own that had a chain in front of it, preventing people without a proper key from parking inside the lot. All of a sudden, the driver rolls down the window and screams, "Get the fuck back here, you little bitch!" He does a U-turn and pulls up to the entrance of the parking lot, and the passenger jumps out and begins chasing me. The driver peels off, presumably to get on the road on the other side to ambush me. My adrenaline immediately hits me and I begin sprinting away from this crazy man. He then yells,
"We're gonna give you a ride. Stop running away from us."
I looked back and we had a bit of distance between us. He looked somewhat chubby and probably wasn't expecting me to be able to run so fast, since I'm slightly overweight myself. I turn onto the road and continue sprinting until I hear a car squeal down the road behind me. I look back to see a single headlight in the distance speeding down the road, and the man chasing after me starting to gain on me. I start freaking out and run and turn left, and began making a break for the park since the area of the park I was running towards was dark and thick with trees, so I figured that I could lose them in there. As I run into the park, struggling to continue sprinting as I was losing my breath, I look back to see the car turn onto the road. The driver then stops the car and yells at his friend, "Hey, get back in the car. The cops hang out back there and they might see us. Leave him. We're getting out of here." The man chasing me stops, turns back towards the car, and flings the door open and jumps in. As soon as he slams the door shut, the driver does a U-turn and speeds off, turns right onto the road up ahead, and then disappears. The park is extremely large, and I remember my parents talking about a good number of drug deals taking place there, and that the police were starting to send officers to patrol the area at night to bust up any drug deals they witness, and that must have been what spooked my pursuers. I jogged quickly into the park and hid in the darkness beneath the trees for about 20 minutes, just to be sure that they were definitely gone, and I tried to calm myself down as much as I could. Afterwards, I walked through the park towards the exit into my community. My senses were on hyper alert. For all I knew, there could have been another weirdo lurking around in the dark. I made it to my house and quickly unlocked the door. My dog started growling but stopped once he saw me walking into the living room. I looked to my right to see my mom passed out on the couch with the TV still on, just as I thought. I walked into my room and flopped onto my bed, exhausted both physically and emotionally. I was so relieved that I had gotten away from those 2 guys, and was never happier to be in the safety of my own home. I always knew it was dangerous to walk alone at night, and I usually don't, but I had hoped when I did, I would be okay. I was proven wrong that night. I woke up around noon, and walked into the living room to say hello to my parents, and my mom gets up and hugs me and apologizes profusely for falling asleep when she was supposed to pick me up. She said that she had woken up around 5 in the morning and freaked out that she had fallen asleep and that something bad might have happened to me. She rushed into my room to see me sound asleep and was relieved that I had gotten home safely. I didn't say anything about what happened on my walk home that night, as I knew it would devastate them to hear that they almost lost their son, and my mom would have never been able to live with the guilt, as she could have prevented the whole encounter if she had stayed awake to come pick me up. Up until this point, I never actually told anyone except for a very close friend of mine about this experience. I have no idea what those 2 guys' intentions were, but I knew for a fact that they were not good, and I don't think I ever want to find out what they were up to. I'm just glad I'm safe. And after sharing this experience with you guys, I hope I can move on from it and leave it in the past. When I was young, up until I was about 10, I lived on a 7-acre ranch. There was a small house in front of the property where we stayed, a huge grass yard and a cabinet shop behind it, and an orchard in the very back full of walnut trees. My father was a carpenter and always worked in the shop, and my mother was a school teacher that was almost always busy. Because of their jobs and the fact that they were kind of new to parenting, as I got older, they really didn't pay as much attention to where I would wander off to. I would spend my days roaming around the yard, playing in the dirt, and running through the walnut trees. I obviously did not question my lack of supervision, as it was fun to explore this huge plot of land, and I thought I was just being a normal kid. When I was about 7, my father surprised me with a brand new child-sized ATV. It wasn't one of those electric ones that you're probably picturing either. It was a damn fast gas-powered 4-wheeler. Now at this point, a good amount of you are probably questioning why someone would give a gas-powered ATV to their 7-year-old child. But like I said, my parents were a bit reckless, and they, well, my dad, just wanted me to have fun. Pretty much right after I got the thing, I learned how to drive it by myself, and I started going further into and past the property than I ever had before. Now I had a free ride to basically as far as my young self will let me go before turning back. I started riding through the orchards behind my house almost every day, and I loved it more than I ever loved anything before. I would leave my house and be gone for hours. After a while, I gradually started roaming farther and farther away from my house as I became more brazen as I got older. I would ride down this dirt path that led past what I assumed was our neighbor's land and to a ditch that held water. At the time, I just liked looking at the water as it flowed, and I felt like I was an explorer. I honestly never contemplated on what I was doing could be the least bit dangerous, and I really don't think my parents knew how far I was riding. When I think back on it now, just the idea of riding a pretty dangerous piece of equipment far away from my house without my parents knowing where I was, and before cell phones existed, is pretty scary in itself, as I could have crashed or hit my head, and no one would have been able to find me. However, luckily this never happened, and it's not what this story is about. So one day, like any other day, I was riding far away from home, and I passed by a man wearing a dirty white shirt, denim jeans, and a wicker farmer's hat. I remember this vividly, as this was the first person I had ever seen in the whole time I had been out here. I remember the surprised look in his eyes as he stared at me while I rode past him. I had no reason to stop, and my parents always taught me about stranger danger, so I kept going and forgot all about it. On my way back home, a couple of hours later, I was coming up to the same spot, and it dawned on me that this is where I had seen the man. I looked ahead, not expecting him to be there. As I said, hours had passed, yet as the trees parted, there he was. I really didn't think it was too weird because I figured that he was either a farmer or a homebody, so I kept driving closer to where he was. He seemed friendly, to be honest. He had a big smile on his face like he was happy to see me. To my 10-year-old self, I thought he was just a friendly guy. So I waved at him as I passed by, and he waved back. I continued on my way and drove home, not thinking much about it. I don't really remember how much time had passed between then and the next time I went riding, but it could not have been more than a couple of days. Like usual, I took the same dirt road, past the same few orchards to the same ditch full of water. I didn't think much about my previous encounter, so I hadn't been thinking about the stranger with the big smile. I was sitting on the edge of the ditch when I heard footsteps in the dirt coming up from behind me. Again, I remember vividly because it was not a common occurrence to see anybody else on this trail. I remember being more curious than scared, and I turned around to see the same stranger with a smile. This time, his smile seemed more like a toothy grin. He called out to me as he walked up, asking me what my name was in a heavy southern drawl. I told him with confidence that I wasn't really allowed to talk to strangers, to which he said, "Well, that's a good idea. Although you really shouldn't be out here all by yourself. It can be dangerous for a kid your age." I remember this striking me in the gut with a little bit of a butterfly feeling. I wasn't afraid, but I felt uneasy. This piqued my curiosity, however, as I wondered what he meant, so I asked him. He continued to walk closer to me as he answered, "I heard they found a little boy out here, just around your age. I think it was in that ditch right there where he drowned." I would like to point out that although my parents were reckless, they were not stupid. If there had been a drowning near our house, or had been a story in the paper, They definitely would not have let me out anymore. Anyways, he continued, "Why don't you come with me and I'll take you back to your parents? It ain't safe around here for a kid your age." It's okay. I have my quad right there. I'll just ride back." I pointed over to the side of him where my quad was, but he didn't look. His eyes remained fixed on me. They were deep and dark, almost black, and piercing into me. At this point, I was scared, and I knew that I was in a bad situation. I was hoping that he was just a concerned old man, but there was no way I was going to go anywhere with him. I got to my feet and started to walk to my quad, to which the man said, "Should a kid your age be riding something that dangerous? Let's just put it in my truck and I'll give you a ride back." "I don't see a truck," I said, looking around, hoping that I could talk my way out of the situation. "Oh, it's right over there on my property. You can't see it from here," he said, his smile widening. "It's really okay, I'll just go now," I said, starting again to walk to my quad. But as I passed him, he reached and grabbed my arm. "You really shouldn't be out here," he said, staring me deep in the eyes. "It's not safe for little kids." "Let me go! You're hurting me!" I shouted, starting to panic. But this only made him grip tighter. "Maybe you don't deserve to go back home. What kind of parents would let their kid out here all alone? Maybe you should come back with me and I'll take care of you." At this point, I was about to pee my pants. I was freaking out, and I started to scream. I can't remember if I was saying anything. I just know I was screaming as loud as I ever had before. This only seemed to anger him. His once toothy grin turned into a face of anger. He put his hand over my face, and I took this opportunity to bite his finger as hard as I could. I still remember the taste of blood in my mouth. I know I must have hurt him pretty bad. Thankfully, this caught him off guard as he finally let me go. I knew this was my one and only chance to get away from this weirdo, so I booked it to my quad as he winced in pain. "You little shit, get the fuck over here!" he shouted in anger. I knew I didn't have much time, so I jumped on my quad and turned the key as fast as I could. As soon as I pressed down on the gas pedal, I felt a hand start to grab my neck. Luckily, he didn't have a grip yet, as I was already starting to drive away. I punched it and got the hell out of there. At this point, all I could hear was the sound of my quad, so I wasn't sure if he was running after me. But I wasn't going to risk looking back. I drove down the dirt path as fast as my quad would go. It was probably the fastest I had ever driven it. When I got home, I peeled out into the dirt road and ran into the house, hoping to God my mom was home. I burst into her room bawling, and there she was. She asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't talk as I was so afraid. I cried for a good 30 minutes before I summed up the strength and told her what had happened. I remember the fear in her eyes as I described what happened. She pulled me close and hugged me as hard as she ever had. The next day, I talked to a police officer and recounted the story of what transpired. I honestly don't remember much after this, as I think I started to block it out. It's not really something a 10-year-old wants to think about. Needless to say, they never let me off the property again. My dad started drinking and we lost the house soon after this anyways, so I didn't have to live there much longer. Recently I was thinking about that day, after I started trying to remember various parts of my childhood. My parents never told me what happened after the cops were called, and I never really asked because I tried not to think about it. So yesterday I went over to my mom's house and asked her if they ever found the guy, considering that he had to have lived pretty close to our property. She was kind of startled by the question because we hadn't talked about this in over 15 years. She paused for a minute, as if pondering whether to tell me, and said, "We didn't have any neighbors out that way. It was all corporate-owned property, and the description you gave didn't really match any of the neighbors that lived in the other direction. We called the cops, and they went to search where you told us you were, but the guy was long gone by the time they got there. They looked around the property and found an abandoned house that hadn't been used in years since the land was purchased. When they looked inside, they could tell that he had been staying there. Apparently, he left his stuff behind. We never told you this because you were too young, but one of the things they found was a black grocery bag. It had a roll of duct tape and a hunting knife inside." "Thanks, Mom. But did I really need to know that?" This incident happened in 2011, shortly after I returned home from college. My family home was a relatively safe area, but around the time I left for school, it had started to decline somewhat. I didn't quite notice right away, and upon my return I was going through a very depressing time in my life. At the time I was staying up all night playing the newly released Elder Scrolls V, and on that particular occasion I had gone all day without eating or getting out of bed except for bathroom breaks. So I decided to go to a very popular 24-hour restaurant located very near my house. It's directly in front of a train stop in my city. There are frequently homeless and transient types around that area, but I never had an issue as the restaurant is typically packed with post-clubbing clientele at these hours. I parked directly in front of the restaurant and go in to order. My food was ready very quickly and I got back into my car. The car next to me pulled out first. I hadn't noticed the driver get in, but I didn't give it much thought. The car then pauses in the middle of the small parking lot. I took this as the driver being courteous and allowing me to leave, so I pulled out and went on my way. As I drove home, the car that had let me out was apparently driving in the same direction I was. Just to be cautious, I didn't go home right away. I kept driving past my residential area, going nonsensical ways, in circles basically. The car continued to follow me. I continued driving until I saw an approaching yellow light. I decided to run the light when it was red. The driver behind me did so as well. It was at that point that I started to get scared. I left my cell phone at home because I was only going to be gone for 10 minutes max. I know, dumbass decision. It was then I made the impulsive decision to go into my residential area. The streets there are like a weird maze. Unless you know it well, it's very easy to get turned around. I turned into an adjacent condo complex that had another entrance directly in my area, but those roads were windy and confusing. I was able to get some distance between me and my pursuer, but not much. As we exited the condos, he was able to see me make a quick right uphill. I drove quickly at this point, using my knowledge of the area to my advantage to lose them. We did this dance for a good 20 minutes before I was able to round the corner near the particular cul-de-sac where I lived, without him in sight. My house is adjacent to the corner home. I turned very quickly into my driveway and shut off the car. I locked it so that all the lights would turn off. I sank into the seat as much as I could, trying to avoid being visible. After a minute or so, I heard the car drive down the cul-de-sac. I heard it turn around at the end of the street and drive back the opposite way. I don't know for sure if it was my follower. I ran into my house after that. It was this event that made me realize that I really need to take care of my own safety, and you never know what dangers may follow you home. What would you do if you were alone in a dark place? Not even a strange place, some place familiar to you, like your own basement or garage, and you happen to see 2 points of light glinting at you from across the room. Would your fight or flight instinct immediately kick in? Or would you freeze, unable to move, because of the shock and terror weighing you down? Back in 2010, I had this experience firsthand, though unfortunately not in a place that was familiar to me. At the time, I didn't know if I would ever see daylight again. I live in Auckland, New Zealand, which is located on the Northern Island. I have a degenerative bone disease that weakens me. It makes me even more frail with every passing year. At the time, I had just been diagnosed and decided to try to live my life to the fullest. I had a friend named Jacoby who was a big-time conspiracy nut. He didn't have a cell phone or a bank account and made some money here and there by showcasing his sidewalk chalk art. I asked him what he would do if his days were numbered. He said that he would find a spot untouched by man and mark his name on a rock. I decided to take his advice and do some cave exploration in the Northland. But I didn't want to visit just any tourist trap cave. I wanted to visit a cave that most people didn't know about. Jacoby and I did some research and made contact with a few hardcore outdoor type guys and discovered that there was a small cave that very few people knew about because it was incredibly difficult to get to. We met up with a couple of guys named Ben and Angus who knew where the cave was, and we put together a group of 6 people to go exploring. I knew the idea of a guy with brittle bones going exploring in caves doesn't sound like a brilliant idea. I had at least 4 people pointing that out to me, but I badly wanted to experience it as soon as possible before I grew too weak to climb a staircase. Ben warned us that where we were going, there was a very small chance of a rescue in case of an emergency, and that we would be all on our own. I said my goodbyes to my immediate family and started the trip at dawn. By 10 a.m., we reached the spot where we would have to leave our car, and by midday, we were deep in the heart of the New Zealand wilderness. Angus forged the path ahead with a machete. I followed immediately after with Jacoby and my other friend Elijah, carrying the tents, water, and first aid, while Ben and another guy named Mark followed behind. All things considered, I was feeling very well despite my condition, and was able to keep pace with the others as the day wore on. Every once in a while we would pass a tree with a weird symbol carved into it, and Jacoby would go on about how some alien race had probably landed there back in World War II after the Nazis failed to colonize Antarctica. I just rolled my eyes. That was the kind of conspiracy theory noise he was always going on about. We let him keep talking because he provided us with some unintended laughs. By nightfall, we were nearly at the cave, so we set up camp and built a fire. And then Ben used a flashlight to lead us to the cave's entrance. We cracked some celebratory beers as we shone the lights deep into the depths of the cave, the floor slanting downwards at a nearly 60-degree angle. We had just finished our beers and cigars, and were all about to head back to camp for the night, when we all heard something echo deep down within the cave. It sounded like a rock had shifted and rolled a bit. Nothing too exciting, but the faint noise was enough to get Jacoby going. He went on about how the Draconians were nearby, and they were hidden in their invisible cloaking devices, like Predator, and we were all in their crosshairs. Ben then screamed into the night that Jacoby was our leader, and his head was the one they wanted, which got us all laughing. We headed back to camp, but as I turned to follow the others up the path, I glanced down into the darkness of the cave, and for a split second, I thought I saw a pair of eyes glinting up at me, reflecting off the night sky before disappearing. A chill passed over me, but I immediately shook it off, convinced that I was just seeing things, and I didn't even tell the others. The following morning, we anchored 2 lines at the mouth of the cave and steadily made our way down, holding onto the ropes for support. Once at the bottom, there was a small cavern with 2 massive rocks that were pinned against each other that we had to crawl under in order to continue deep into the cave. We each had 2 flashlights, water, and were each tied to another person so no one could get lost. Mark and I were attached to each other's belts by a cord, and together we made our way in front of the others and deeper into the dark, rocky void. I'm not sure how many of you have been deep underground, but it's a thrilling yet terrifying experience. You can almost feel the weight of the earth crushing down upon you from above. The air is extremely stale and dusty, and absolutely everything echoes. We got used to keeping our voices low as we spoke. All in all, we were underground for a good several hours, pausing every so often to take a breather, but for the most part continuing to push onward down the twisting, winding cavern. We reached a section of the cave where it was too narrow to go any further, as the crack in the wall was barely big enough to fit me moving sideways. I took out a spray can and marked my initials on a rock, and then began the rough uphill climb with Mark back to the others. We had been out front the entire time, and we were heading back from what we had assumed to be a dead end. So imagine my shock when from the darkness behind us came the faintest sound of what sounded like short, sharp intakes of breath. Mark and I both heard it and turned back around, shining our lights back down the way we had come from. But we didn't see anything. Mark made a comment that it had to be the sound of air moving through a crack in the wall, and we kept moving. After 2 minutes or so I paused, positive I heard the sound again, which didn't make sense, because if it was really just air coming through a crack, we would have been out of earshot by now. I glanced behind me again and nearly gasped out loud. This is going to sound incredibly cliche, but I saw them again. 2 pale eyes barely discernible staring back at me from the shadows. In that moment, I thought of screaming and telling Mark to run, but I forced myself to keep a straight face as I turned back around and continued climbing. I thought about dogs being able to tell when humans are afraid and attacking if they ran. In my mind, whatever was behind me was keeping its distance for now, hesitant to get too close. But if we started to run, the thing might have felt emboldened and started to chase us. For the next half an hour, Mark and I made our way back through the cave. me glancing over my shoulder every 5 minutes, but I didn't see the eyes again. When we met up with Ben and Elijah, I didn't say anything about the eyes. I was terrified that if I said anything, they might have wanted to retrace our steps and get a closer look. We made our way back to the mouth of the cave, much more slowly than I would have liked. And after another hour or so of carefully watching our footing, we emerged from the cave's mouth and back out into the daylight, which nearly blinded me. It took another 40 minutes before Angus and Jacoby clambered out, and in that time, I was having a nervous breakdown, convinced that the unseen thing had grabbed them in the dark. Turns out Angus had taken a fall and scraped up his leg, and they had to move slowly. Even after we returned to camp, started a fire and cooked dinner, I kept my mouth shut. Everyone was in a good mood and having fun. I didn't want to cause concern or suspicion bringing up the eyes. Now that I was back out in daylight, I was starting to convince myself that I had never seen them at all. That night I had trouble sleeping. I tossed and turned in my tent for so long that I actually caused the tent to detach from its lining and collapse in on itself. I cursed and struggled in the dark to find the zipper and free myself. When I finally poked my head out of the tangle of cloth, I froze. Right at the edge of the campsite, staring directly at me, were the eyes, closer than they had ever been. I felt around in the dark until I found the flashlight, and without breaking eye contact, I turned it on, keeping my hand pressed over the light. The eyes were still there, unmoving, unblinking, and in that moment, I had my chance to shine the light directly on the thing, but I didn't. I couldn't. After maybe a minute, the eyes disappeared, and I heard a rustling in the undergrowth. I stayed dead still for what seemed like a small eternity, and eventually passed out from exhaustion. The next morning, Jacoby woke me and pointed out fresh marks on a tree right at the edge of the campsite where I had seen the eyes. 3 vertical cuts with a 4th horizontal one underneath. Jacoby was convinced the draconian race had visited us, but when I made eye contact with Ben, he looked disturbed, and from the look in his eyes, I got the sense that he was familiar with whatever I had seen the night before. Perhaps he had seen it too. We packed up and left, and we all made it back safely. I can't really describe why I didn't point the light at the eyes. I guess a part of me was terrified of what I would see. I suppose it could have been nothing, or something that was laughably obvious and unthreatening. But I don't think so. I believe that it was more than nothing. I believe it was something. Something I couldn't describe even if I had seen it in the light. I haven't been exploring since. I still live in New Zealand, but my condition has gotten worse, and I am now bound to a wheelchair. Regardless of that scare, I'm glad I took the trip. I still talk to Jacoby every now and then, and even though I would never admit it, maybe some of those far-out conspiracy theories aren't as crazy as I once thought.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
A friend of mine told me the story about a girl that she met from Sweden who stayed with her for a while. The girl was in her mid-20s, and we'll call her Jane. Jane was driving to her mother's house one late evening. She lived far away from the city in a heavily forested area. There wasn't any streetlights on this road, and not a lot of houses. The few houses that were built were back in the forest and had long winding driveways so you couldn't see them from the road. As she was driving, something up ahead on the road caught her eye. It was a small bundle on the side of the road. As her car passed the bundle, she was shocked. It looked like a baby wrapped up in a blanket. Jane slammed the brakes, stopping about 50 meters up the road. She reversed and then jumped out of the car as quick as she could. As she was thinking that someone had abandoned the baby on the road, Jane ran over to the bundled up blanket and exhaled a sigh of relief. It was just a toy baby. Just as she had made to pick it up, she saw headlights coming down the road in front of her. Suddenly realizing that she was standing on the road alone at night, she ran quickly back to her car, jumped in and quickly started the engine, and then drove off. The car behind her sped up, coming really close to the back of her car, honking its horn at her. Jane was now panicking. She started driving faster and faster, constantly checking her rearview mirror. Although she couldn't see who was in the car behind her, she was still terrified. Eventually, she reached her mother's driveway, which was still about 2 miles long. Her mother lived deep into the forest. She thought to herself that if the car followed her down the driveway, she would call her mother and tell her to ring the police. And as she turned onto the driveway, the car behind her followed her, still very close. She kept thinking back to the baby toy and how creepy the evening had been. Jane got out her phone and called her mother. She told her that she was being followed and to call the police. She was expected to arrive in about 5 minutes. Both cars were going way too fast for that tiny narrow dirt road. There was no street lights, so all that Jane could see was what was being lit up by her headlights and the headlights of her pursuer. She then saw her mother's house in the distance of her headlights. The car behind her was still very close, still blaring their horn so loudly, Jane's ears began to ring. As she got to the house, she jumped out of the car. Her mother was standing at the front of the house, waiting for her with a kitchen knife in her hand. The car that was following her also stopped, and the car doors flew open. An elderly couple got out of the car and started shouting and pointing at Jane's car. "Someone got in your car!" they screamed. That's when Jane realized what happened. A man jumped out of the backseat of Jane's car and ran into the forest. Everyone just looked at each other in shock. The car that was coming down the road had seen someone jump into her car when she stopped to check the baby. It was likely that the man had left it there on the road and was watching for people to stop, taking advantage of people's kindness. As I said at the start of this story, a friend of mine told me this story and I believe it to be true. If anyone else has heard of this, please leave a comment down below. And always remember to lock your doors whenever you get out of your car. This happened to my sister about 15 years ago when she was still in high school, and I was in middle school. Our mom worked as a house cleaner and always became friends with everyone's home she would clean. One of the homes was owned by an older couple who had no kids but had a huge house and a really nice pool that they would always invite me and my siblings to come swim in. The husband worked as a COO of a large airline company, and they lived in a very nice neighborhood on a large lot surrounded by forest. When you were in their backyard, you couldn't see the other houses at all, just trees. It felt very secluded. Their house was very angular and architecturally interesting, with multiple levels made from stone. Pretty much every room had huge floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the backyard and gave great views during the day. At night, however, the reflection from the inside lights prevented you from seeing out, so it was always a bit unnerving to walk by them since you couldn't see what was out there. The couple also decorated with old Native American art and masks, which was a little creepy to a middle schooler, but the couple were very nice and not so creepy, so I never got too scared. They had an older golden retriever named Samson that lived up to his name, as he was massive but had a sweet and gentle temperament. They also recently rescued a husky mix named Sadie, who was the polar opposite, Psycho Sadie, as we so lovingly called her. She had intense separation anxiety, and she would destroy their house whenever they left her inside, jump their short fence if they left her outside, and if they took her with them to run errands, she would destroy their car and howl non-stop until they returned. So since they were wealthy and had extra money, they would pay for me or my sister to come over and dog sit while they went out. We got $20 an hour, so we were always excited to go over there and watch cable and swim in their awesome pool. Normally everything would be fine, and both dogs would usually just lay around. But occasionally Sadie would realize that I was a stranger and go nuts and start barking at me, and I watched her eyes literally turn red. I was convinced that she was going to attack me, but she eventually calmed down after I got up from the couch and showed her how big I was. Not, but I digress. This particular incident happened over Easter weekend, while the homeowners were out of town for 2 days. They were paying my sister to stay there over the weekend, and I stayed with her the first night. Because it was a big house and kind of scary to stay there all alone, we stayed up late watching movies and eating junk food. The next day we swam in their pool and hung out. But for some reason I didn't spend the night again, and I'm so glad I didn't. Because what happened that night scarred my sister for life. It all started when my sister was working out on their treadmill. Their workout room was on the bottom floor of their home, which was a walkout basement. Just outside the room was a huge sliding glass door that opened to their patio and pool. She had the TV on in their workout room. As she was running and watching TV, she thought she heard the house alarm beep like it did whenever the door was opened. She stopped the treadmill and went to look around and saw that the sliding glass door was opened. Now this door was huge. There was no way it could have opened by itself, so she was instantly freaked. However, the dogs were just lying there in the workout room, and she figured that they would have gotten up to investigate if someone had come inside, and because Sadie was a bit crazy and hated strangers, she thought that she might have accidentally left the door open and just imagined the beep of the alarm and that it could have come from the TV or the treadmill. She closed and locked the door and went back to working out. A couple of minutes later, she had the distinct feeling of someone watching her. She looked around, but no one was there. She finished her workout, but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She decided just to go to bed, as she was becoming a little creeped out, and just wanted to forget about it. She went around and made sure all the doors were locked. The owners didn't give her the alarm code, so she couldn't set it. She took a shower and locked herself in the guest bedroom, with both dogs, just in case, and eventually fell asleep. A couple hours later, she awoke with both dogs growling at the door of the room. Now, it was fairly normal for a psycho Sadie to growl and bark for no reason, but Samson had never barked or shown any signs of aggression, so immediately my sister knew something was up. She was shaking and trying to convince herself that the dogs had just heard an animal and that it was nothing. But then she heard the dreadful door alarm beep. She called my dad in a panic, crying and screaming, and he told her to hang up and call the police, as he was on his way over. She called the cops, and my dad made the 15-minute drive in just under 5 minutes. When she opened the bedroom door to let my dad inside the house, the dogs took off running and barking through the house and downstairs to the basement. My sister ran screaming all the way through the house to the front door to let my dad in. He quickly took a look around the house with his gun, but did not see anything unusual. The police arrived a few minutes later and looked around the property. They found that the back gate was open, as well as the sliding glass door again, but not enough to let the dogs out. Just barely ajar, like it had been slammed shut and bounced back open a bit. They said it looked like someone had entered the home through the sliding glass door because the lock was tampered with, but they determined that whoever it was hadn't stolen or disturbed anything. When my dad asked why someone would break in and not do anything, especially with the dogs locked up, the police said that they had been notified by the homeowners earlier that month that the husband received a death threat because of a decision that he made at his job that put a lot of people out of work. They had gone to the police about it, but didn't bother to tell my sister to keep an eye out for anything suspicious. Needless to say, we never dog sat for them again, and they moved out of state within a few months because the husband lost his job. And if you ask me, he deserved it. During my first and only semester of college, my very good friend Jake was dating this girl Stacy that we knew from high school. For reference, I'm a female and was 18 at the time. I'm now 26. Now, many people back in high school did not like Stacy, and I was one of them. To me, she was the definition of a sketchy person. She was a pathological liar and not even a good one, as her stories rarely added up, and she would constantly contradict herself, sometimes within minutes after she spouted her lie. She was one of those girls that hated drama, yet it always seemed to magically follow her around everywhere she went. She was constantly in and out of relationships throughout high school, and would go out of her way to prove that they were crazy by spreading rumors about them, and getting as much sympathy from everyone around her as she could. She always had to be the center of attention wherever she went. I remember during prom night she was dancing with her then boyfriend, and he accidentally stepped on her foot while dancing. She caused a huge scene about how he was physically abusing her. It was painful to watch. There's much more I could get into about this chick, but in general, she's just an extremely toxic person who nobody should be subjected to be in the presence of. It's also worth noting that she had a drug problem that she would often try to hide. This will come into play later. Anyway, back to the story. Jake and Stacy had class together and hit it off rather quickly. Jake was skeptical at first, but when Jake brought up her reputation in high school, Stacy claimed that she was raped by her ex-boyfriend, and that was why she acted the way she did, and that she worked on getting better and was now fine. My friend, being incredibly insecure about being single and being way too trustworthy, believed her and began dating her soon after. The relationship was extremely dysfunctional, and was rampant with emotional abuse and manipulation on her end. But the aspect that I want to focus on was her constantly trying to squeeze money out of him and her aforementioned drug problem. Stacy would constantly ask Jake for small amounts of money, usually ranging between $10 and $20. Jake didn't mind all that much, as he bought into her story of struggling financially, so he felt bad. But one day she asked him for $500 to cover her rent, to which he refused. She flipped out on him and didn't talk to him until she drunk dialed him late that night and began revealing that she was doing drugs, and it was all because of how terrible her life was and that he wasn't helping. I don't know why he didn't break up with her then and there, but the next day they talked it out and made up, and the issue was dropped. Here's where everything finally comes to a head. It was around 10:30ish on a Friday night, and keep in mind that they have been dating for nearly 2 months at this point. I'm chilling in my living room with another friend of mine. We're sitting on the couch bullshitting about stuff going on in our lives when I get a call from Jake. Jake explained to me that Stacy was hanging out at her friend's house and asked him if he could come pick her up around midnight, as the buses in that area stopped running after 8, and she needed to be in work at 9 the next morning. He said sure, and as the time he needed to leave to pick her up drew closer, his mother called him saying that she was working overtime and wouldn't be out until around midnight, and she had the car. He asked if I could drive with him to go pick up Stacy. I'll admit that I would rather have left her to her own devices, but he sounded desperate and he's an amazing friend who would do anything for me, so I did him a solid and told him to start walking over to my house. He gets to my house about 40 minutes later. My friend went back to her house. She lived across the street from me, and Jake and I got in my car. He texted Stacy and told her that we were leaving now, and that I was driving him, to which she said the dreaded K. We got to Stacy's friend's house, which was located on the outskirts of town in a pretty sketchy neighborhood. The road was very poorly lit, and to my luck, the streetlight in front of Stacy's friend's house was off. I refused to park in front of there, as I didn't feel comfortable sitting in the dark, so I parked 3 houses down, between 2 cars under a functioning streetlight. Jake texts Stacy, "Hey, we're here." She didn't respond. As we were waiting there, a truck drives by, and I noticed about 4 men in the truck. At first, I figured maybe they were lost and looking for an address, but this thought was thrown out the window when not even 2 minutes later, the truck drives by again, this time slower. The guy in the front passenger seat makes direct eye contact with me as the truck passes by my car. I tell Jake something is definitely wrong and to call Stacy so we can leave. He agrees and calls her. It's dead quiet outside, so I hear the conversation. She answers and says, "Hey, where are you?" "We're down the block. Come outside." "I'm looking outside and I don't see your car." "We're in my friend's car. It's a gray Subaru." And almost immediately after he says that, the phone call drops. Jake just looks at his phone in complete confusion, wondering what the hell is going on. I'm starting to get extremely nervous now. Between the truck that was circling around before and Stacy's sketchy behavior, I decide that something is up. I'm not just going to be a sitting duck. I pull out of the spot and drive up in front of the house, and as I'm pulling out, I hear a vehicle loudly in the distance behind us. I look in my rearview mirror and see the truck from before now quickly driving up the block. I freak out and floor it out of the spot and begin speeding up the block. The truck catches up with me, and Jake yells at me to turn and that they're trying to shoot the car. To my horror, I look behind me and the guy in the back seat is leaning out the window with a gun in his hand, aiming at my car. I quickly turn and floor it down the road as they struggle to follow behind us. I made another turn left, narrowly missing an oncoming car, and I slammed on the gas. Luckily, I'm halfway down the block by the time they turn onto it. I'm surprised I was driving as well as I was at the time. Jake said I looked extremely calm and determined during all of this, but inside I was freaking out. I was worried that they were going to run me off the road, or we were going to get a bullet in the back of our skulls. I made another left turn and drove like a bat out of hell towards the highway. The truck turned on the block, but then stopped when I got close to the highway. I turned onto the highway and merged into the next lane. A few minutes passed by with us going back and forth questioning on who those guys were and what they wanted, when Jake gets a call from Stacy. He picks it up and puts it on speaker and shakily says, "Hello?"
"Where are you? I'm fucking waiting for you,"
she screams. He explains the situation, to which she proceeds to call him a liar and says that he was never there and he was standing her up. Jake loses his shit and screams at her that we almost got killed and calls her out on her bizarre behavior throughout all of this. She starts yelling again, but then she goes silent and we hear a door quietly open and someone calling in the background.
They got away. Stacy, where the fuck are you?
Silence follows this for a few seconds before the line goes dead. Jake and I look at each other, and Jake said, "She had something to do with this." Long story short, we spent the entire drive theorizing on why this happened, and we think we may have hit what happened. Jake brought up her asking for money before, and when she asked for $500, she probably needed the money to pay off a dealer. She had to find another way to pay off her debt. We think that she set us up to head to that house, and those guys who were probably the dealer and his buddies would conveniently show up, looking to rob us of everything, and possibly jack the car hoping that it would cover her debt. She probably thought that Jake was using his car, not realizing that we were actually using my car, which explains why they circled the block in confusion, and why she hung up the phone immediately after Jake gave her a description of my vehicle, as she possibly called the dealers to update them. I dropped Jake off at his house and went home. I know people say that after scary encounters they always are shaken up and their emotions are running in a million directions, but I was just emotionally drained. It felt like I just couldn't feel anything, and I wanted to go home and go to bed, which is what I immediately did when I got home. I filed a police report the next morning on those guys, and they said they would look into it, but I never heard anything from them after I filed the report, so who knows what they've been up to ever since. As far as Stacy goes, our theory was further solidified when Jake saw her in class on Monday, where she approached him and berated him for Friday night, claiming that she walked all the way home and had her phone and wallet stolen by some druggies. Jake basically called her out on that whole night, claiming that she set us up to get robbed, to which she denied and called him crazy. He told her that they were done, and she just yelled, "Fine!" and walked to the back of the room. The druggies were probably the dealer and his friends, who robbed her to cover the debt. To our surprise, she never attempted to contact us again and kept her distance, probably because she knew that we were onto her and wanted to keep the heat off of her. After I dropped out, I never saw her again, and the last I heard anything about her was from Jake, who told me that she developed a long-distance relationship with some guy and dropped out halfway through the semester to move up north to live with him. As far as I know, that was the last time anyone ever saw or heard from her. Overall, I'm happy I trusted my instincts and picked up on the fact that something was wrong, as this encounter may have had a different outcome. In hindsight, they most likely weren't going to kill us, but it's easier to say that after the fact, because at the time, we didn't know what their intentions were, and for all we know, they may have even planned to do more than just rob us. So Stacy and the 4 men in the truck, my life has been going perfectly fine since we met. Please do me a favor and don't ruin it by crossing paths with me again. This event happened to me back in the summer of 1989, on a remote speck of land in Pawnee, Kansas, back when I was 30 years old. It was early evening and the sun was setting. There was a warm breeze outside, which I remember clearly because I had just burnt a bag of popcorn in my defective microwave and had flung open the windows to air out the kitchen. I don't remember what I left the house to go and find, but after tossing the burnt bag of popcorn into the trash, I recall exiting out the back door and walking towards the barn. I remember hearing a noise off to my left in the field, like a faint cough, but I ignored it. My mind was focused on other things, and I wasn't even remotely worried about a complete stranger could have been wandering across my property. As it turns out, I should have been. When I exited the barn and made my way back towards the house, I stopped dead in my tracks as I made eye contact with a very large and extremely unkempt bearded man, perhaps 10 yards away from me. Judging by the amount of gray on his beard, I determined him to be 60 or older. He was barefoot, wearing stained overalls in addition to suspenders over his bare torso, which struck me as being unnecessary and strange. While his body looked extremely worn down and tired, his eyes were wild and fierce, and full of hunger and malice. In his right hand he carried a hatchet, and before I could form a sentence, I already visualized in my head how many steps it would take for him to reach me. I was alone, a vulnerable young woman, with no one around for miles to hear me scream, trapped out in the open by this man who appeared to have sprung from the grass, blocking the path to my house. I'm not sure how long we stood there in silence, but I recall I was about to ask him what he wanted when the man spoke up. I remember his voice was much deeper and more elegant than I expected it to be.
I'll spare your life for some whiskey.
I stammered something, I don't recall what, and the man raised his voice and screamed at me.
Whiskey!
I took a reflexive step back, and the man started stomping towards me. He didn't raise the hatchet, but I'll never forget the hatred in his eyes as he closed the distance between us. That's when it happened. Blood exploded out of the side of his head, and he collapsed onto the grass, making a sound like a grunt as he hit. I might be remembering things slightly out of sequence, but I thought I heard the crack of a rifle echo after he fell, not before. I didn't stop to think or look twice. I sprinted for my kitchen, terrified that someone would fire a second shot at me. Once inside, I should have locked the door and called for help, but instead I grabbed my car keys, ran out the front door, climbed into my tiny red Volvo, and drove to the nearest police station. It wasn't until I spoke to the officer at the desk that I realized that I had blood splatter on my dress. 3 police cars escorted me home, at which point it was long after dark. They combed the area with flashlights and discovered a large pool of blood on my back lawn, but there was no body, not even the hatchet. They set up a perimeter and expanded their search, but by the time dawn came and my husband returned, they had found nothing. No trace of the bearded man, or whoever had fired the rifle. They asked me multiple questions about the man and the sound of the gunshot. I suppose they were trying to determine the caliber, and perhaps deduce how far away the gunman had been standing. But the incident happened so fast that there was some information that I just couldn't provide. The police brought out their hounds, who traced a scent for over a mile into our backwoods until the trail went cold, and nothing further was ever discovered or reported to me. To this day, I can't describe exactly who that bearded man was, or who ended his life. My family has suspected that he might have been an escaped convict, or a deranged madman, and whoever fired that shot must have been hunting him, and chose to act in that moment to save my life, because I have no doubt the bearded man would have done some serious harm to me. Sometimes I can bring myself to feel grateful to the unseen shooter, but other days I feel cold inside and afraid, knowing that regardless of whatever my family reasons or suspects, I'll never know for sure if that person with the rifle had not actually been aiming at me. This happened a couple of days ago to me and my girlfriend. We were house sitting for my girlfriend's dad. My girlfriend's dad lives in a rather large house in a suburban neighborhood just outside one of the major cities in Denmark. What I'm trying to say here is that his neighborhood isn't exactly scary or dangerous by any means, which only meant that this gave us a bigger scare than it probably would have had it been in one of the more dangerous parts of town. After coming home from buying groceries and stocking up on necessity for our weekend stay at his house, we went to the living room to lie down and have some quality time for ourselves, which we hadn't had in a long time. Now, before I go any further, just let me clarify the lay of the land here. This house had a rather large living room and a floor-to-ceiling window at the end of the room. Outside this floor-to-ceiling window is a sensor-triggered light system. As we were lying there watching TV, I get this weird feeling that something is watching me. At first, I try and shake it off, like it's no big deal, thinking to myself it's probably just because I'm in a new house, where I don't yet feel entirely at home. But as I look to my girlfriend, I see too that she is quite shaken up about something. After a few minutes of silence, she then asked me if I had the same feeling as her, like someone was watching us. I try to play it off as nothing, and I tell her that I'll just go grab a cigarette and check to see if anyone's out there, just to make her feel safer. As I turn my head towards the floor-to-ceiling window, I notice that the lights are on. Now this shakes me to my very core, and I quickly decide not to go out for that cigarette. By this time, I feel my girlfriend's hand squeezing my arm. As I turn around to her, I see her pointing at one of the windows, and outside is a silhouette of a person. My blood freezes. In that moment, I turn around and quickly grab my phone, and as I turned back, the person had disappeared. I call my parents, as I know they were out at a friend's house not too far from where we were. My dad tells me to lock all of the doors and windows, and just sit tight and wait for them to arrive. A couple of minutes go by, and nothing happens, other than me trying to get my girlfriend to calm down, as I know how this affects her blood sugar levels, and I would rather not have her have a seizure while a creeper or burglar or even a murderer is walking around outside the house. The silence is then broken by the sound of windows being tampered with. At this point, I'm trying really hard not to freak out and cause any further panic. But luckily, seconds later, I hear my dad pull up outside the house. My girlfriend and I have since discussed who it might have been, and we've come up with a few possible suspects. One of them being my girlfriend's crazy mother, who has a severe mental illness. The other more possible suspect would be just a simple burglar. I don't really care who it might have been. I'm just glad whoever it was didn't manage to break in. This happened 4 years ago in the early hours of New Year's Day. For reference, I was 17 at the time, and I was in my senior year of high school. I was around 5'10" and weighed about 160 at the time. I lived in the suburbs. I was at a New Year's party being held by a friend of mine, whose house was a 20-minute walk away from my own. It was around 1 in the morning, and I was about to leave with another friend of mine who lived on the same block as me. My friend who was hosting the party asked me if we wanted to ride home, and in hindsight, we probably should have took him up on his offer. But our neighborhood was pretty safe, and we figured that with the two of us walking together, no one would bother us. Plus, there was probably other people at the party who would need a ride home more than we did. We said our goodbyes to everyone and began our walk home. The road was predictably empty with no one but us walking along the sidewalk, and maybe the occasional car passing by. Everything was pretty well lit, so we weren't walking in complete darkness. My friend wanted to pick up a pack of cigarettes on the way home, so we stopped off at a gas station along the way. When we got to the gas station, it was nearly empty, with only a woman at the pump filling up her car, and a guy outside the front of the store on his phone. We went inside and my friend bought a pack of cigarettes. We walk out of the store and my friend immediately lights his cigarette. We reach the sidewalk and we hear someone behind us yell, "Hey man, wait up!" We look behind us and we see the guy who was in front of the store quickly walking towards us. He looked to be in his early to mid-20s. He was around 5'8", maybe 140 pounds by the looks of him. He approached us and asked if he could get a light. My friend and I did not think much of it, and he lit the guy's cigarette. The guy thanked him, and we began walking away. But the guy continued to follow us, asking us where we were going. We told him that we were heading home. He said that he was at a party and he was heading back over there, as he left to get some fresh air. He asked us if we wanted to come to the party. This is officially the point where red flags start going off. Why the hell would a guy in his mid-20s ask two teenage boys if they wanted to go party with him? We told him bluntly that we didn't even know who he was. Nor did we know anyone at this party he was talking about, so we weren't going. The guy starts laughing and says that we seem like cool guys. He told us that we needed to lighten up. My friend and I told him that we were 18 and 17 to see if that would get him to leave us alone. To this, he just chuckled and said that age didn't matter to him. He had a brother who was 16, that he partied with him and his friends all the time. Jesus Christ, can this guy take a hint? I thought to myself. We were a little less than 10 minutes away from our houses, and we didn't want this creep following us all the way there. I told him firmly, "Dude, we're not going anywhere with you. Now quit following us and fuck off." The guy gets livid and starts screaming at us for being unfriendly and considerate assholes, and that he was just trying to be nice. He then starts throwing racial slurs at my friend. It's probably worth mentioning by now that I'm white and my friend is black. My friend yells at him to get away from him before he cracks him in the face, and then the guy proceeded to run away from us. My friend and I look at each other in complete disgust over what happened, and spent the next 5 minutes walking and talking about the creepy guy. We both agreed that he was probably drunk or high from a New Year's party. Next thing we know, we hear a car behind us. It proceeded to slow down to match our pace. We see the windows roll down, which revealed the guy we had just seen a few minutes earlier, with who we presumed to be two of his friends, one of which was a man probably the same age as the guy, and a woman in the back seat who had to have been in her mid-30s. The guy tells us that we got off on the wrong foot, and then asked us once again to join them at the party. My friend and I look at each other and I whisper to him that we needed to get away from them. My friend tells him that we're not going with them, and to leave us alone already. The guy was silent for a few seconds, and then said, "You're coming with us, one way or another." They pull over quickly and get out of the car, which caused my friend and I to immediately go into flight mode. We turned right on the side block and my friend yelled, "Run to the park! We'll lose them in there!" We looked behind us and to our horror, the 3 people were running right for us. We run into the park and once again we look behind us, and this time they were even closer. We ran for a thick patch of trees that covered a good portion of the west side of the park, hoping to evade them. I was panicking at this point, because I couldn't see a damn thing, and I was worried that my friend and I would trip over something and get captured by one of these sick freaks who wanted to do God knows what with us. We hear one of them trip and fall behind us yelling, "Fuck!" And luckily we see light again, and we made a left onto the path. We heard more yelling behind us, and one of the guys saying, "Shit, they got away." The woman yells at them to split up and search the park. We bolt towards the bathrooms, which thankfully were open, and we hide inside. We took a minute to catch our breath, as our lungs were practically burning at this point. We should have called the cops and just hid until they got there, but at the time we were so focused on getting the hell away from those crazy people that we decided to try and make our way to the nearest exit of the park and run to my house. We waited for about 2 minutes. We then bolted out of the bathroom and towards the exit of the park. Shortly before we exited the park, we heard one of the guys yell from somewhere behind us that he found us, and we were getting away. We looked behind us to see the guy in the distance starting to chase after us. We ran until we reached my house, and I quickly opened the door and we ran inside. We both just sat there in silence, trying to regain our energy and calm down after what happened, hoping they didn't see where we ran to. I looked out the window several times over the course of 10 minutes, and thankfully, they never showed up again. We talked about it and we were glad that we were both okay, and that nothing bad happened to us. We were trying to figure out what they wanted from us. Did they want to kill us, rob us, or something worse? My friend hung around for another half hour before he insisted on heading home. He left and I went to bed. I kept thinking about what happened. I eventually fell asleep, and I woke up and told my parents about what happened. They were thankful that me and my friend were okay, but were upset with us that we chose to walk home, and we should have accepted the lift from my other friend, or even called them, and they would have come and picked us up. Regardless, we filed a police report and I gave them all the information I could. Unfortunately, we never heard anything about it again, and I sometimes wonder what the hell they've been doing ever since. I really hope they never harmed another person after that. I can't express enough how thankful I am that we managed to get away from those freaks, and to this day, this incident is still the scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my life. It definitely made me more wary of my surroundings, and I try my best to avoid situations where I would need a walk late at night, rather if I'm by myself or not. I don't know what would have happened if those people got their hands on me, but I do know one thing. I never want to meet those people again. Ever again. Last year, I took a road trip in my Nissan Altima from Prescott, Arizona to New Orleans. To make a long story short, my ex-girlfriend, who was a tattoo artist, was being sued by a guy that she had once inked over an injury that he had apparently sustained during the session. She had asked me to come as a witness on her behalf, as I had been there the night in question. The trip was scheduled to take me between 20 and 22 hours driving along Route 40 East. I popped in my headphones, tossed my bag in the front seat, and started driving before the newspapers had been delivered. It should be noted that the Altima was a 2-door coupe, and the only access to the back seat was by folding the front 2 seats forward. Rarely did I ever have more than one person in the car, and I could hardly ever place anything in the back seat. Most of the time I forgot it was even there. The first part of my trip went smoothly. Traffic was light, the weather was fine, and my playlist was keeping me entertained. And yes, I know that it might seem a bit strange that I listen to my music through headphones while driving instead of using the radio, but that's just how I choose to relax. My first pit stop was in San Juan, New Mexico, where I refueled and grabbed a bite to eat. Afterwards, I got back in my car, popped my headphones back in, and continued on my way east. Upon returning to the car, I noticed a stale taste in the air, but I dismissed it as a lingering scent from the restaurant. I drove for maybe another hour, when I decided to pull over on the side of the road. I had to make a phone call and take a piss. By that point, I was in Texas, and on a long stretch of highway that was pretty much desert in every direction. I stepped out of the car, stretched my legs, and took a discreet leak behind a bush. And then I called my ex to make her aware of my progress, and then dropped a quick voicemail to my boss. Keep in mind this whole time I'm pacing along the side of the road, but ultimately I was facing my car. There was no one around. And even though every half minute or so another car would pass by, nobody stopped. Before I got back into my car, I put back in my earbuds. I closed the driver's side door and started up the car, fired up the AC, and was just shifting the car into drive when my passenger door slammed shut. My heart leapt into my throat, and I tore my earbuds out and looked over to my right. The front seat was pushed forward, and out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone walking away from my car. I yelled, "What the fuck?" and spun around in my seat, immediately power locking my doors. The person walking away from my car was a short, disheveled man with thinning hair and a jean jacket with no shirt on underneath, maybe about 50 or so years old. I watched him in my rearview mirror, staggering around like he was drunk. He walked to the middle of the road where he stopped, bent over, and then vomited all over the pavement. That's when I noticed that he was wearing corduroy pants and blue Crocs. He wiped his mouth and turned to look at me. His mouth was kind of lopsided, and he was missing a few teeth. I heard him say something, but I could barely hear it from inside the car. I dialed 911 and gave the operator an estimate of where the guy was and that he tried to get into my car. I watched as the guy began walking off into the desert. Hanging off his belt on his back, I noticed one of those leather pouches retail employees keep utility knives in. I told the operator he had a knife and drove off. Whatever was going on, I didn't want to get involved and potentially get stabbed. I was so shaken up that I didn't stop again until I was running on fumes, playing in my head over and over again how that guy had gotten so close to my car without me noticing. Where did he even come from? The next time I stopped for gas was when it hit me. I didn't smoke, but there was an empty cigarette pack in my back seat. That's why the stale taste had been in the air. He had been lying in my back seat ever since I left San John, and I hadn't even noticed. When the door slammed, he hadn't been trying to get in. He had been getting out. I had been listening to my earbuds the entire time, and I hadn't heard or noticed anything. He could have stabbed me at any point, and I would have never seen it coming. I'm not sure if he was brain damaged or strung out drunk, but whatever he was, thank goodness he didn't decide to hurt me, and that he got out of my car, and I didn't end up transporting him all the way to my destination. I never found out what happened to him or what he wanted. I rarely tell this story to anyone. Most people find it hard to believe and assume that I'm just messing with them, and I wish I was. I haven't listened to my earbuds in the car since. Someone that I used to know as a child committed an act so cruel and disturbing that I wish I had never met them before in my life. My parents found a house in a poor neighborhood that was south of Washington State. When we first moved in, me and my family introduced ourselves to the neighbors, where I met some kids around my age. One neighbor, who lived 2 houses down, established a friendship with my mother, and they became very good friends. They were both mothers and connected with similar interests in art. The neighbor's name was Heather. Heather had 2 kids, and at the time they were both in high school. Their names were Sierra and Jordan, and my mom wanted me to meet them since my parents were looking around for a babysitter. She wanted it to be someone that she could trust, since the area wasn't the greatest environment for kids. After spending some time with Jordan and Sierra, I got to know them a little, and frankly, I enjoyed their company while they watched over me as babysitters. Hanging around them made me feel much more superior than the average 5-year-old. Jordan was a rebel teen who would constantly get in trouble at school. My mother was not a fan of Jordan getting in constant trouble, so my mom stopped having him over. Sierra was a very kind and courteous person and began babysitting me by herself. She was a freshman in high school and needed the money. She became my childhood babysitter. She had no history of being in trouble at school or at home, so my mother gladly let her babysit me. Sarah would play board games with me, cook my favorite macaroni and cheese, and I gradually became closer to Sierra within a short span of time. My parents at the time received full-time jobs, so they asked Sierra to babysit me more, and in return, she would get paid more from my parents. She took up the offer, and I spent more time with her every day. I began to think of Sierra as one of my best friends at the time. She really did have an impact on my life. She also began working with my mom as a house cleaner. Everything was going great for me and my family overall. A couple of years go by, and I'm beginning elementary school and going into the 1st grade. My parents began picking me up from school, and I had less time for a babysitter. I became somewhat distant from Sierra, as she had become a junior and was now pregnant. She would sometimes come over the house and babysit me and help my mother with a few chores around the house, but she became more mature and wouldn't talk to me as much as she used to. Her mother, Heather, had a severe medical condition, which caused her to have constant painful headaches that she would experience for days at a time. Heather stopped talking to my mother and became a recluse, staying inside of her house with Jordan and Sierra. Sierra's demeanor began to change as her mother's condition began to worsen, which was understandable at the time since her mother was going through a rough time. She began displaying an odd change of behavior and started getting into trouble at school. For what exactly, I honestly don't know, but it started to put a strain on Heather and Sierra's relationship, and they began to verbally fight with each other almost every day. Sierra would scream at Heather and flip out on her mom for very insignificant reasons. My mother caught wind of the altercations and told Sierra that she couldn't babysit me anymore, but could help her with chores when I wasn't there. One day Sierra was helping my mom clean out the basement when she asked if she could use our bathroom. She came down back to the basement 5 minutes later and finished cleaning. Later that day, my mom had to use the restroom. When she walked in, she saw what looked like a diary on the bathroom sink. My mom didn't recognize it, and with curiosity, began to open the book. What was in there was absolutely terrifying, as my mother found sections of the diary which graphically talked about rape and molestation. My mom never got into specifics about what was in the diary, and still doesn't like talking about it. My mother found Sierra's name on the back of the diary, and immediately called Heather and confronted her about Sierra's diary. Heather stated that Sierra had taken cuts from one of her books and began writing them down in her diary. Heather acted like Sierra did this all the time and it was no big deal. My mother then told Heather that Sierra was not allowed back at the house, and she wasn't going to be working with her anymore. She purposely left that diary there, but for what reason? I honestly don't know. Sierra had begun to claim that my neighbor Rodney had sexually assaulted her. Everybody in the neighborhood became skeptical of Sierra's claim due to her troubled behavior and never having much interaction with Rodney. Sierra never called the police, and Rodney was never questioned about the accusations. Heather's medical condition worsened even more, and as a result, she died while Sierra and Jordan were both in their senior year of high school. Sierra dropped out of high school and claimed that she would be moving to Arizona with her then boyfriend. She ended up moving out and going out to Arizona while Jordan moved in with his dad. When they left, my parents thought they would never hear from Sierra again, since she had moved on with her life. A few years go by and I didn't hear anything about Sierra or Jordan, and frankly, I kind of forgot about them over the years. One day my parents talked to John, a neighbor who lived across the street. He asked my parents if they remember Sierra, and if they had heard from her since. My parents said they hadn't heard anything about Sierra since she moved. John said that he saw Sierra on the news, and that she had been arrested for child neglect. Police in Arizona arrived at Sierra's home after she called 911 and once she found her daughter deceased. She had been collecting welfare and living in a trailer with her 2 children. Those kids were neglected and suffered from malnutrition, as Sierra became fat and wouldn't give the children barely anything to eat. There wasn't any air conditioning in the trailer, and Sierra would leave her kids in the trailer and go live at a friend's house or a boyfriend's house. She ended up going to trial in court for manslaughter and is now serving a 16-year prison sentence. I can't believe to this day that someone that my family trusted with me and was a best friend of mine for the majority of my childhood years would do something this cruel and inhumane. I wish that she never has another child in her life and never gets another dollar from welfare. Sierra, fuck you. Back in the spring of 1999, I was living in a loft apartment in Boulder, Colorado. The ceiling above my kitchen table leaked whenever it rained, and the window unit air conditioner was louder than a freight train, but otherwise it was acceptable and cozy, with a great view of the Rocky Mountains. At the time, I was writing articles for a paper, and after I had finished working my shift at the hardware store, I would spend about 3 hours writing and editing my column before bed. Normally, I would get to sleep by 1 or 2 in the morning. Directly across the hall from me was a second loft apartment, which had been empty for a few years, before a middle-aged woman and her cats eventually moved in. They were the only 2 apartments on the second floor of the building, but our doors didn't have numbers or indicators, such as apartment A or B, to distinguish the two separate residencies. I had a P.O. box and I never received any mail at home anyway, so it didn't really bother me. But it did cause some confusion that I believe nearly resulted in my death. One evening I was typing away on my computer while listening to soft classical music on the radio. When I got up to refill my glass of wine, I walked past my front door, and completely on a random impulse, I decided to look out the peephole. I don't know what I expected to see. It was just after 1 in the morning after all, but sometimes you just need that peace of mind, which is exactly what I didn't get. Standing outside my neighbor's door, directly across from me, was a short, heavy-set bald man with gloves on his hands, but no shoes on. I remember spotting his gray socks against the dark wooden color of the floorboards. He wore a dark green windbreaker and jeans, and appeared to be testing the knob of my neighbor's door. I remember the sensation of my heart skipping a beat. I had no idea who this man was. I had never seen him before in the building. But it was his actions more than his appearance that made me uneasy. It was clear that he was trying to be very quiet. He had no key, but was cautiously turning the knob back and forth to see if it was unlocked. I stared at him suspiciously for perhaps 30 to 40 seconds, concentrating very hard on keeping quiet, aware that if he got the door open, I may have to run and find my phone to call 911. After another few moments, he released her knob and bent down to open a gym bag by his feet that I hadn't noticed before. I caught a side view of his face, and he looked older than I had initially expected. Suddenly noticing his face made me nervous for some reason, and I began to feel my palms starting to sweat. Realizing I still had my wine glass in my hand, I took a careful step away from the door and set my glass down on the table. I returned to the door, both hands carefully pressed against the wood, as if making to reinforce it. I peered out through the peephole again. My blood froze. The man was looking directly at my door, standing completely still, a look of suspicion in his dark eyes, and a crowbar clutched in his left hand. My heart began pounding so loud in my ears, I was convinced that the stranger could probably hear it. The kind of peephole the door had didn't really work only one way, like most of them do nowadays. It just kind of frosted outside of the glass to blur the view of whoever was inside. All the lights in my apartment were out except for my desk lamp. When I stepped away from the door, had he seen the lamp shining through the peephole? And when I stepped back, had he noticed the small pinprick of light vanish? I felt sweat begin to form on the back of my neck as the man took 2 steps forward and jiggled my knob, which was securely locked. I forced myself to stay put, worried that if he made to break in, even with my full weight on the door, I wouldn't be able to prevent him from getting in. The man jiggled the knob twice more, and I was terrified by the fact that we were so close together. Had the door not been there, he would have been able to feel my breath on his skin. I watched as the man again looked up at the peephole. I remember his blue eyes feeling cold, savage, and malicious. I just knew that he intended to cause me or my neighbor harm. That's when the unthinkable happened. He knocked softly 3 times on my door, and I heard him whisper, "Open it." There was no way he could have known for sure that I was there. I imagined he was trying to get a reaction in case someone was standing there, but I was legitimately too terrified to move or speak. In fact, I was barely breathing. It's clear to me that's what he was doing, because when I had been across the room at my computer, there was no way I would have heard that knock. It was a direct threat to whoever was close enough to hear it. The man stood there for maybe another 10 seconds, then he grabbed his bag and headed down the stairs, barely making any noise on the wood, thanks to him not having shoes on. I remember being too afraid to turn my back on the door, terrified that he was bluffing, and that he would come back upstairs at any moment. I made myself count to 20, and then I took a deep breath, walked across the room to my desk, and picked up my Nokia cell phone and called the police. Whispering the entire time, I informed the operator that there was a suspicious man right outside my apartment door, but I had barely spoken for a full minute when she informed me that a squad car was already en route to that address. I happened to glance out the window, and I noticed the bald man was standing on the sidewalk beneath me. When he saw me peeking, he waved a hand up at me and then disappeared across the street into an alleyway. I nearly choked on my breath and told the operator exactly where the man had gone. When the police arrived an agonizing slow few minutes later, They searched the alleyway before coming up to interview me and my neighbor. She had called the police a few minutes before I had, because she had seen the shadows of feet coming from under her door in her dark apartment, thanks to the light in the hallway. She revealed that she was in the witness protection program, and before the morning came, she and her cats were taken away by 2 men in FBI jackets, and I never saw her again. I went to the station the following day and provided a description of the man to a sketch artist. To this day, I'm not positive the stranger was specifically looking for my neighbor, but if I had to guess, I would say it wasn't just a burglar looking to rob us. My theory was that because there was no numbers on the doors, he wasn't sure which apartment was hers, and therefore tested both. When he wasn't sure which apartment to break into, he decided to play it safe and leave. To the best of my knowledge, they never caught him. I have nothing but my own personal suspicions, but I suspect my neighbor may have had something to do with the ongoing trial of Whitey Bulger and the Winter Hill Gang. When she had spoken to the police, I noticed her Boston accent, and a year later it was all over the papers how Whitey and his gang member associates were being charged with multiple murders and colluding with a crooked FBI agent named John Connolly. The following day, I added 3 more locks to my door. I never saw that man or anyone else suspicious outside my door again. I lived there for another 4 years, and that second apartment was never rented again. This past August, I picked up a lot of side jobs house sitting while working at a ranch that gave horseback riding lessons. The families were all very nice and it paid well. This past November, I was house sitting for a family and watching their Labrador retriever named Maggie while they were on vacation. They lived in a very nice neighborhood on the outskirts of a small town. The house was on the far end of the neighborhood, and thick trees flanked the backyard, and a dirt road ran behind the trees. I accidentally went down the road the first time and tried to find the house, but there wasn't much down there. Just an abandoned house with lots of deer in the front yard, and a small run-down ranch house. The first night, everything was great, but the second night, not so much. I had this weird feeling a few hours before I went to bed, but I wrote it off as spending too much time reading creepy stories on Reddit. I made sure all the doors were locked, blinds were closed, and I went to bed just after midnight. But as I fell asleep, I still couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. Maggie usually sleeps with me, but that night she just followed me up the stairs and to the bedroom, and then just sulked back downstairs. At 2:26 a.m., Maggie woke me up by standing next to the bed and whining. I had just let her out before I went to bed, and I was pretty sure she didn't have to go to the bathroom. I rolled over and hoped that she would stop, but she didn't. I gave in soon enough, and as I climbed out of bed, I realized that the house was freezing cold. I followed Maggie downstairs to the kitchen. All the doors to the house were weird. You can't open any of them from the inside or outside without a key. Not to mention this was a very heavy door, not the kind that just gets blown open by the wind. The only thing that eased my mind was that Maggie didn't seem ready to kill an intruder, and she'll usually at least bark at you. So I did a quick look around. I was too scared to do anything more. Nothing seemed out of place. The owners often left credit and debit cards, as well as wads of cash lying on the counters, and it was all there. If anyone was going to steal something, it was right next to the door, and easy pickings. But since nothing was missing, I tried to brush it off as just forgetting to lock the door. I made sure it was locked this time and went back to bed. Maggie still didn't want to sleep with me and went back downstairs. Less than an hour later, she woke me up again. This time, I didn't question her. I crept back downstairs more cautiously than I had before. The back door was open again. This time, the key that had been sitting on the kitchen counter was in the lock. Someone had been in the house with me. The police were called. They looked all around the house but found no one. Everything of value was still in place, so I was really worried about the intentions of whoever broke in. The family was shocked that something like that happened and have since moved to a large farm 20 minutes away and now have video surveillance.
There's always a reason to be afraid.